Members, we're now in public session and I would like to invite members of the public and the witnesses into the room. Members, we're content to start the meeting in open session.
Yes.
Members, I've received apologies from the Deputy Chairperson and Mr Flanagan and Mr Hussey. Are members aware of any other apologies? No? Okay, members, while we're waiting for the public to come in, I'll just do the minutes of the meeting of the 15th of October. If members are content, I'll sign them into the record.
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay, members, we'll just wait for the witnesses to come in so I can do some housekeeping. Okay, members, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Public Accounts Committee. Some housekeeping rules just for members and members in the public gallery. Could you turn off all mobile phones and electronic devices with the exceptions of your tablets, as it is not sufficient to have your mobiles on silent mode as they continue to interfere with the assembly recording of today's session. Members, we have no items of correspondence or matters arising to consider today, so we'll proceed into the next item on the agenda, which is agenda item 5, the inquiry into the Courts and Tribunal Service Trust Statement 2012-2013. And we'll just pause for a moment till we get the witnesses into the room. Do any members wish to declare an interest in this subject matter today? No interest. Claire? Okay. Okay, members, I'd like to wish you thank you all for coming here today, and there's no declarations of interest. We have with us today Mr Nick Perry, who's the Accounting Officer from the Department of Justice, Mr Mark Hamilton, who's the Assistant Chief Constable from PSNI, and Mr David Lavery, the Director of Access to Justice from the Department of Justice, and Ms Jackie Durkin, who's the former Chief Executive of the Courts and Tribunal Service. We also have Kieran Donnelly, who's the Comptroller and Auditor General, and Mr Jack Laborie, who is the Treasury Officer of Accounts from the Department of DFP. Members, you'll find the biographies of all our witnesses on page 23 to 27 of your packs. So thank you for joining us today. You are all very welcome to our committee. Mr Perry, I believe you wish to make an opening statement by way of the context for this evidence session. I invite you to do so.
Chair, thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I should say at the start that the Department welcomes the findings contained within the audit reports of the 2011-12 and 12-13 Trust statements. The statements highlight a number of operational and policy issues we've been dealing with as we work to improve fine collection and enforcement. There are weaknesses in our current system, and I acknowledge that. We are working hard to overcome them. Effective fine collection and enforcement is strategically important to the Minister and the Department. The imposition of fines is a core part of the justice system and will remain so. While clearance rates here are comparable to other jurisdictions, we completely accept the points in both the NIAO reports and by Sejini that police-led fine enforcement, while relatively effective, is not an efficient use of policing resources, and that the use of imprisonment, except in extreme cases, is not an appropriate sanction for the fine defaulter or a good use of prison service resources. Against that backdrop, in 2012, David Ford announced his intention to change the system fundamentally. The Department has therefore been working in partnership with PSNI, courts and others to establish a system that encourages payment and deals with default in a more flexible and innovative way. A key element will be a new fine collection and enforcement service. We estimate that the new arrangements will increase payments prior to default hearing by at least 30%, reduce the number of enforcement warrants going to the police by over 90%, and reduce prisons admissions by 80%. Our intention, subject to executive approval, is to introduce the necessary legislation next year for enactment during the current Assembly mandate. Thank you, Chair. We stand ready to assist the committee in any way we can.
Thank you, Mr Perry. Can I start this session by making some opening remarks and asking the Department of Justice representatives that are here today a few general questions? I refer to your letter, Mr Perry, of the 15th of October regarding today's evidence session, and as outlined in your letter, I do appreciate that you cannot go into the specifics of the ongoing suspected fraud case, and I do acknowledge that you have given an undertaking to provide further evidence to this committee in person or indeed in writing upon conclusion of the court proceedings, and the committee does welcome this undertaking. However, in the meantime, can you comment in the more general terms about the lack of control over cash collections that this case has thrown up?
Yes, Chair. Well, if I could start on that. Obviously, the identification of a number of issues within the PSNI is a matter of concern to me as the accounting officer. Those issues were identified, as the committee may be aware, as the audit report, I think, brings out, by internal processes, by reconciliation exercise between the court service and PSNI, and then by investigation by PSNI, including by its own internal audit service. So there were weaknesses. The governance arrangements identified some of those weaknesses, and the police are now have taken steps to strengthen the controls in place. And I'm sure Mark can provide further detail later if you wish, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr Perry, the value of outstanding fines to be recovered is 19 million. This is a significant balance and is 1.5 times the total value of fines imposed in 2012-2013. It would take a lot of fines to make up that 19 million. Can you explain why the value of fines outstanding is so high, and how did we get ourselves in this position?
Yes, certainly, Chair. I completely recognise the point you're making. That level of debt is high. Of course, as the audit report brings out, of the 19 million that was outstanding at that snapshot on the 31st of March 2013, around 6.5 million, or 34%, was not yet overdue. And I think you would expect in any fine enforcement system or any system of this kind that there will always be cases going through the system that have not yet reached their default date. But there is a total there of £11 million that is outstanding, and that's a situation that has, I think, built up over a number of years. But we are still hopeful that a relatively high proportion of that debt will be recovered. The trust statement refers to an impairment figure of 6.5 million, I think, which is the figure that it is suspected will not be recovered in full in monetary terms. But we hope about 2.5 million of that will be discharged in other ways, by imprisonment or by the court remitting the fine. So the overall figure is a large one. In fact, some of it has not yet reached its payment date. Some of it is being paid off in instalments. And of the remainder, we still hope, if not to recover the full value in cash terms, at least in terms of imposing the sanction that the court intended for a significant proportion of that to be imposed.
Okay. It's difficult to get a handle on how much the fine enforcement system actually costs. That said, there are obviously costs associated with the NICTS time, and indeed the PSNI time, default hearings and prison service costs also. Can a total annual cost be provided? I mean, is there anyone costing this archaic system?
Well, if I just speak generally, and then Jackie or Mark mentioned, the cost of the system as it ran till March 2013 was about £3.3 million a year, and a great proportion of that was taken up with police time. The system we have at the moment, which is a transitional one, following the ruling of the Divisional Court in March 2013, we estimate to cost about £2.8 million a year, and that, an element of that is an increased cost to the court service and to legal aid, but a reduced burden on the police as a result of a reduced number of warrants. And in the new arrangements, we hope to bring in, by around the end of 2016, we hope the cost will fall to about 1.8 million. So there is a cost, undoubtedly, to enforcing fines in the fine enforcement system. I hope that will reduce over time.
Thank you. Ms Durkin, did you want to add to anything to that? Or?
Just to add about the costs of the fine collection scheme in relation to trying to chase payment of fines, what we've found is that through the implementation of the fine collection scheme, people who haven't paid their fine by the due date, if they're reminded to pay, a further third of those will actually pay up and pay to the fine collection scheme, and it costs approximately £240,000 a year to administrate. Obviously, the routine collection and payment and accounting tasks associated with accounting for fines, that's built within the budget of the Courts and Tribunal Service, but specifically in relation to pre-enforcement or enforcement activity, the fine collection scheme in the Courts and Tribunal Service would be an indicator of how much the costs are to Courts and Tribunal Service.
I'll not dwell on that one because I know other members have that line of question. But it's clear that urgent reform is required as the current system is not fit for purpose. So given consultations on fine collections that date back to 2008, why has reform not been taken forward as a matter of urgency? Mr Perry?
I think, Chair, a good deal of urgency has gone into trying to bring around reform. Justice was devolved, as you know, in 2010. In 2011, a public consultation proposing significant reform to the fine system was issued, and that reflected some of the recommendations in the Sergini report of 2010. In 2012, the Minister made his announcement that he was minded to bring in fundamental reform. 2 years on, we have turned that concept into a detailed operational model which we've costed, and we're working urgently on the legislation. We aren't quite as far on as we would have wished. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is the complexity of the DOJ's legislative programme. We'd had hoped to include these provisions in what we call the Faster, Fairer Justice Bill, which is now being considered by the Justice Committee. But that just got too unwieldy, and these provisions were taken out to follow on later, and the Minister informed the Justice Committee of that in 2013. And in addition, we had the Divisional Court ruling in March 2013, which raised issues for the operation of the current system, and some urgent work was needed around that. But we have also been doing, to prepare the way for the future arrangements, we have been trialling some aspects like supervised activity orders and doing other things. So I think quite a lot of effort is going into getting a reform system in place as soon as is practicable.
Okay, thank you. I may come back to that. I'd now like to invite members now for their line of question. Mr McQuillan, are you happy enough to go forward?
Yes, thanks, Chair. Can I ask you, Mr Durkin, Nick told us there it was £11 million outstanding debt recovery. The figure we have is £12.5 million, so there's £1.5 million of discrepancy there somewhere. What's £1.5 million among friends? Could you tell us now how hopeful Nick was hopeful that he would get that recovered? How confident are you that we can get this recovered?
Well, if I could just mention that the figure that was published in the audit report was at a specific point in time, so it will always move as people pay, so it's not a static figure as such. In relation to am I hopeful that they will be paid? Well,
Nick was hopeful. I asked how confident you were that we will get that.
Well, historic trends would suggest that at least 50% of the money due would be paid, and a further 10% should be paid through enforcement. But what we've found is that more and more people are seeking to pay their fine through instalment orders. There's almost 3 times as many people asking for and being granted instalment orders in the years 12-13 than there would have been in, say, 2007 to 2008. So every effort is being made to make it as easy as possible for people to pay their fine. They can pay in person at any court office, they can pay by post or online or over the telephone. So what we're trying to do is to look for ways that will encourage as many people as possible to pay their fine.
So are you confident then?
I would be confident that the same level of payers who pay without enforcement activity will hopefully continue to pay.
Yeah, thanks for that. Can I go on and ask you about missing warrants. Are these warrants going to be reissued? What way are we going to get to those?
The missing warrants are missing paper warrants. There's no missing record of the warrants. There's an electronic record of the warrants, but there's no supporting physical hard copy paper warrant to support it. Of those, of the 6,682, 5,276 of those have been reviewed by district judges in the Magistrates' Court. 1,182 have been sent for a default hearing. 3,862 have been remitted by a judge, and there's 230 that are still to be reviewed, and a further 2 that have been queried. So significant progress has been made in identifying the actual status of those warrants and where they should be reviewed by a judge. They are being put in front of a judge to review.
How long have you known about these missing warrants?
2011-12, we certainly were made aware by the PSNI that they couldn't trace a physical paper warrant to match the electronic record we had of them.
And why do you not do something sooner rather than leave it till now about chasing these up?
Well, I think we have since computer system was implemented in 2006. We had Courts and Tribunal Service implemented a computer record for all warrants and knew at that stage how many outstanding warrants we had. And then with further IT developments in 2009, we were able to share information electronically for the first time in Northern Ireland to get an overview of the number of outstanding warrants for every area in Northern Ireland. So it's something that has been ongoing for some time. We certainly were aware of the level of outstanding warrants, and have discussed that with the police at various points and through various fora, such as the Criminal Justice Board.
Mark, we'll move on to the police then. 6.5 million of debt as compared to 1.1 relating to the missing paper warrants. How have you got to this stage?
Well, we're talking about a period of time from 1981 to 2009, when it was a solely paper-based system. I can't give you a definitive single answer as to why this has happened. There are a number of issues we feel, and Jackie has outlined some of how the warrants have been broken down. Certainly over the period that we're talking about, we have to accept that we have physically lost some warrants. And for that, I have to accept entire responsibility. In a paper-based system where there's a physical transfer of the warrant from the court service to the police service, and then distributed out to dozens of different police stations around the province, and then into the hands of different police officers at different times, I have to accept that warrants have gone missing. I also have to accept that in the downsizing of the police service, as police stations were closed, and papers removed and so forth, that there have been administrative errors, administrative failings. We have of these missing warrants, the police service has no physical record of their existence, and that's the sort of the crucial aspect of this, that the court service have the record of them, but the police service don't for this period of time. So I suppose I'm trying to give you a number of suppositions and hypotheses as to where they could be, but I have to accept that in the paper-based system that there will have been administrative errors. There may have been warrants pinned to the back of other warrants. There may have been warrants that were multiple warrants executed on one person, but only one warrant returned. There's any number of reasons, I suppose, that we could, I believe that we can point to for this proportion. To give it some context, we think the missing warrants we're estimating is probably less than 0.9% of all the warrants to be dealt with over that 30-year period. And that's by no means an excuse, and I'm not offering it as an excuse at all, and I'm not offering any excuses for any administrative failings by us, but we do accept there have been failings, but it was it was in the management of the physical pieces of paper.
Yeah. Can I just take you on then? What assurance can you give us that the cash hasn't been fraudulently recovered?
Yeah. And I think this again is, I know that again this is an area where I will struggle to give you a definitive answer. Any cash handling system and any system involving the executive warrants, particularly going back over this period where controls were different, relies upon trust. And relies upon the trust of those who were operating the system, that that they didn't lose warrants or they didn't execute it and then reported as being lost. I have no specific evidence or intelligence to say that again happened, certainly to any degree of in any systemic way. We do have issues over the years of individual police officers or individual members of staff who we have investigated for either maladministering the warrant process, or on occasions, as we have at the minute, somebody who has been committed for trial on suspicion of a theft. As someone has said to me recently, the trust is very good, but supervision is better. There are, in any of these systems, unfortunately, the potential for single points of failure. Those single points of failure tend generally to be the human factor. I can't give you a categorical assurance that over the period of 1981, particularly to 2009, that there hadn't been a fraud. I have no strong basis to say that there has, but equally from an auditing position, I completely accept the auditor's position that from an auditing assurance position that can't be guaranteed.
Yeah. Well, what assurance can you give us now that from then onwards that certainly not take place?
Well, first of all, the critical difference post-2009 is that there are no paper warrants. Warrants are transferred electronically to the police service, so a police officer, certainly in my view, as when I was a constable, you'd have taken the warrant with you out to someone and knocked on their door. That no longer is the case. You just press out a warrant notification form and it prints out. So we cannot physically lose a warrant anymore. Again, I couldn't categorically assure that somebody couldn't necessarily corrupt the computer system, but there are auditing records in the computer system. I know, as I'm the head of anti-corruption for the police service as well, I can account for every single keystroke on every computer in the police service at any time. So I will know who's done what and where in respect of the warrant. So I would like to hope that there's no way a warrant could go missing, and therefore that area of potential concern for fraud, I hope, in terms of missing warrants, is not going to be a pressing issue going forward. I do accept, and the auditors have pointed out to us, that there are other areas around cash handling which continue to present risks. But in terms of the missing warrants, and I don't know if Jackie feels differently about this, but I don't feel that that risk is the same as it was pre-2009.
No, I think certainly there's tighter controls, as Mark said, around electronic tracing of where the information is and who has access to it, and who's been involved in any particular warrant at any point in time. And I think that certainly has strengthened controls in the audit trail around that. But also, as Mark said, any cash collection system is inherently risky, and it's about the controls that we all have to put in place to minimise the risk of any fraudulent activity occurring.
Chair, one more question.
Yeah, okay.
Nick, can I ask you, on figure 1 of the report that shows that 8.2 million in relating to outstanding warrants, debt relating to outstanding warrants, and you're only expected to recover 33.1 million of that, 37%. And that's not a very good return rate. There's 5.1 million outstanding warrants. It sends out the wrong message to the potential undermine the system, the justice system.
Well, Mr. Quillen, it's in relation to that 5.1 million figure that we hope that the equivalent of £2.5 million will be discharged in other ways, mainly by imprisonment or by some other sanction, or by the court withdrawing the fine. So it's still not satisfactory that 2.5 million will not be properly dealt with. But in terms of providing some assurance about the effectiveness of the justice system and some disincentive to those who think they might get away with not paying their fines, that's an important thing.
Yeah, but do not send that message out by...
Well, I hope not. As I said, our intention is the future arrangements will get better at recovering the actual money. But in terms of imposing a sanction on people who have broken the law, as handed down by the court, I mean, I think that's the equivalent of something like a 70% imposition rate. I would want it to be better, but it's not as bad as it seems.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, just before I let Mr. Mr Girvan, and I just want to apologise for the noise. There's some disruption going on in the background. There's necessary works being carried out to the roof, so that's what the noise is, so apologies for that. Mr Girvan?
No, it's just to go in on the back of Adrian's query there. In paragraph, I think it's paragraph 19 of the report, it alludes to costing 3 million to the PSNI for the recovery and the issuing of warrants or whatever warrants and collection. That's the cost to the PSNI. So am I to understand? I just want to get my head around the figure. To lift £3.1 million worth of fines, it is costing us £3 million to administer that process through the PSNI. Is that correct?
No, I think the overall figure for police recovery of fines is. I'm trying to get my head around that, but Jackie may be able to provide it. But in any given year, about £12 million of fines are imposed in an ordinary year in Northern Ireland. About half of that will be paid without any enforcement action, and then another 10% of that will be secured as a result of police enforcement.
If there's 12 million in fine, and of that 12 million, roughly 6 million of that is paid directly through the court service. Yes. So that leaves you with 6 million. That 6 million then are passed over for collection on many occasions by the PSNI. Is that correct?
That's correct. And
they lift how much? 3.1 million?
Perhaps I could ask Jackie to answer that specific question if I may.
Certainly in terms of, just checking here on the figures of...
in terms of the numbers, we would execute about 22,000 warrants, which would apply to about 10,000 people, because most of them are multiple offenders, so to speak. So in the last year of full operation, we executed 25,000, so it's 25,000 activities. I don't have the quantum for the value of each of those, and then obviously within that, then there's the number that go to court, or sorry, that go to prison. And part of the costs as well have to be understood in the sense that a fair percentage of these are executed outside of prison hours. So 43% of those who are arrested require to be held overnight in a custody suite. So the costs kind of increase.
But can I say that a lot of people actually present themselves at the weekend knowing exactly what's going to happen, and therefore it's discharged because they've actually presented themselves to the police, and the courts are not open, or the prisons are not taken, so they'll be held and maybe get out, and that's their charge cleared. It's not an acceptable use of it. But I'm keen to actually break down this 6 million. I'm just using that as a round figure. That's 6 million, and what is recovered, and it costs 3 million in police time to administer and deliver that. And I hate to say it, but it's a very strong case being made for actually changing how this whole process is done, for a far more efficient service. I come from the private sector, and I tell you, if somebody came to me with and owed me £6 million, if I thought it would cost me £3 million to recover 3 million and have nothing, I would not be in business. And can I tell you, nor should a whole lot of the people that are involved in this. It makes a very strong case for privatisation of the whole process, and it would put civil servants out of work. And by not being efficient in the way it's delivered, this report does nothing to help that. Absolutely nothing.
Well, I completely agree with you, Mr. Governor, that it does not affect the best use of police resources, which is why we are changing the system, and the future loading on the police will be significantly reduced once the changes have come in. We will try and get you the figure of the actual cash.
If I have the figure, available now. In terms of monies, actual monies paid on foot of a warrant in 2011-12, there was 8.4 million in money collected on foot of a warrant, and then warrants.
Can I ask what you mean by on foot of the warrant? Is that the person coming back down and saying, "Oh, thanks for calling them a door. I'll go to the court on Monday morning and pay that"?
No, that's actual money collected by the police on foot of a warrant, or some of that could be paid at the prison, and then a further 6.1 million was cleared by way of the defendant spending time in prison.
Don't know the figure. Sorry, don't know the figure that the cost to collect that 6 million. That's what we're trying to get.
Well, I think that's what the police are saying.
We would aggregate what we describe our opportunity costs as around £3 million a year in terms of police officer time employed in the whole warrant process, and that's based upon an average of around 22,000 warrants a year. So those are average figures between the 09 period and the 12 period, as close as we can. So, and that's the figure.
If I could come in the back of that, the underlying point here, and it's a very fair point about cost effectiveness. The fine system isn't primarily about collecting revenue, it's about enforcing the judgment of the court. And so to that extent, in some circumstances, it is legitimate to spend more to enforce a sanction than the value of what that you might get back. So there are two parallel requirements here. One is, of course, proper cost-effective use of public money. And to go back to what I absolutely accept, it is not a good use of police time to be doing this kind of work, which is why we're changing it. But the other is to make sure that court sanctions are properly imposed, and that goes to the, if you like, the credibility of the justice system.
Decriminalising the payment of TV licence and such like, and the way that would be dealt with through.
And again, I agree with you, and the Minister has been in that is not a devolved issue, as you're aware.
Just to make it clear, it's cost £3 million to collect six million. That's what the figure we're talking about there.
No, the figure, if it's the police are estimating £3 million a year, and on fit of a warrant collected in 11/12 was 8.4 million, and then 6.1 was cleared otherwise by payments. That means either remitted or a person serving time in prison instead of actually paying the fine or whatever was due.
And that second part, of course, the imprisonment part of the police of our own.
It's part of the £3 million that we invest in, because we would obviously arrest them, either take them straight to prison if the prison was open, or bring them to custody suite and hold them, and then take them to the prison the next morning.
If I could just supplement what Mark said, that the important thing, I think, McQuillan, is the court, when a fine goes into default, the order of the court is that the person should go to prison. At that point, they're allowed to pay their fine to avoid going to prison. But the emphasis then is, and that's why it's a police job, is arrest them and commit them to prison. Now they can pay the money to the police officer to avoid that happening. They can also pay the money to the prison governor, or their families can pay it. So, but the order at that point is imprisonment, because that's what the law says. Now, the Minister feels that that's maybe not an appropriate sanction going forward, and thinks more people should pay the fine. So that's why we will introduce this new system. And just to comment on Mr Girvan's point, that we did test the idea of privatising with the Justice Committee of the Assembly, and we didn't get much encouragement, I have to say. We'll try to prepare legislation that will leave that option open, but at the moment the intention is that the court service would run the new fine collection and enforcement service that we'll be introducing in 2016, and the running cost of the whole system then will go down to about 1.8 million.
And ultimately, we don't want civil servants to lose their job over this. Sure. So that's the important thing, and appreciate that that's what we're trying to ensure, that we get value for money as well.
And I suppose, Mr Girvan, the point is the Enforcement of Judgments Office, which will run this, are a debt collecting department or branch of the court service. The police aren't really debt collectors. They're about enforcing the law.
I think it's an appropriate use of police time. And that's that. Well, maybe I'll maybe bring that in my other point.
Mr Biggs and then Mr Clark for supplementary.
The Assistant Chief Constable has indicated it's only recent years that the reliance on a paper warrant has moved on, and that electronic information is deemed to be sufficient. My question is to Nick Perry. It's been decades now that emails, have been equivalent to a written document in law. Why has the justice system been so slow to innovate and modernise and be more efficient and avoid this type of thing, where someone who's convicted of an offence will get away scot-free because a bit of paper went missing? Why are you so slow to innovate and modernise?
Well, I agree that digitalisation is definitely the way to go for the entire justice system. The development that Mark was referring to was the expansion of the Causeway system in 2009 that encompasses this, and the Causeway system is at the electronic basis of the justice system now, and is an effective system. The other major system in play here is the ICOS system used by the court service, which is a very effective electronic based system. So we are trying to make full use of technology, Mr Beggs, and you're quite right, that's an area we need to develop. But in this particular case, the introduction of those technological changes have greatly eased the management of warrants.
Why have you been so slow?
Well, it's the causeway system was introduced in the course of the 2000s. Over a period of 4 or 5 years, it was a major investment, and it's quite a significant success.
But it wasn't a success because it wasn't interactive with the rest of the justice system?
It was a success in that it identified and is helping to cure this particular issue about missing warrants. It has made the transfer of electronic information about warrants around the system a great deal easier. So there's a platform there to be built on, but it has been relatively a success so far.
Are you open to change in the future when it's obvious it needs to be changed?
I think that definitely in the future we need to enhance digitalisation.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. Mr. Clark, you still wanted to?
Yeah, Chairperson, one of the things that, in terms of Nick Perry's response there to Roy Biggs, one of the things that actually worries me is that you've actually got something at the moment that's broken, and one of your changes would be to try and transfer this to privatisation. That actually concerns me, even in David's response a few moments ago, was that this is what you looked at in terms of the Justice Committee. This report actually, in my mind, says that the PSNI failed in terms of, so, I mean, the Assistant Chief Constable talked about the £3 million. £3 million to provide a service, which they have failed to do. I mean, in terms of the amount of money, respectively, they collected over a service that cost £3 million, you're talking then about transferring the service or looking at another model to transfer the service. But obviously that the service that you've provided, or the police have been providing, hasn't been fit for purpose. You're going to transfer this function to another organisation in a state where you actually couldn't do it yourselves. Is this because you have continually failed and you can't live up to the challenge to actually deliver the service yourselves, that you're actually going to try and pass this off to someone else to actually collect these fines?
I'll happily take Mr. Clark's question. The Minister decided quite early on in devolution that sending people to prison when the court said they should pay a fine wasn't a satisfactory system going forward, and greater emphasis should be placed on encouraging payment of the fine or alternative sanctions before imprisonment. Imprisonment will remain a sanction under the new arrangements. Anybody that refuses to pay will still face imprisonment, but we're going to introduce a collection service which will have performance targets to try to recoup a much greater proportion of the fines outstanding.
Sorry, and I apologise, I missed the start of this here. But if I'm reading this right, there's £5.1 million in terms of outstanding warrants.
Yes.
So PSNI, in terms of outstanding warrants, the Assistant Chief Constable referred to the £3 million in terms of what it costs them as a service. There's £5.1 million of outstanding warrants. I presume those ones that they actually haven't even got round to dealing with yet.
I think all outstanding warrants were recalled in 2013 because you maybe
because
you weren't here for that part of the discussion,
no,
Mr. Clark. There was a legal challenge that stopped the system dead in March 2013. Right. There was a legal challenge to the way the warrants were issued by the courts, and we recalled all 36,000 outstanding committal warrants. And we had the judiciary review those. That brought to light that there were a number of warrants, old warrants particularly, that couldn't be accounted for, and that's where this particular number we're looking at now has come from. But we actually recalled all 36,000 warrants to have them reviewed because there was a doubt about the legality of the way they had been issued. And it took us about a year to introduce a new procedure which is now operating since June. And we'll be working through the backlog, if you like. But it did bring to light the fact that there were a number and perhaps a disturbing number of warrants that were in the system for execution that weren't accounted for. At least it has brought it to light, and we will now be able to go through that process. And as Nick had said earlier, the greater proportion of those have now been reviewed by the judiciary. Some have gone forward for enforcement, some have been remitted.
On a slight aside issue then, you talk again in terms of privatisation in this, or you presented a paper. Were you proposing at that time to transfer £3 million actually for someone to run the service as well?
No, we estimate that the new system will cost £1.8 million. We've modelled the cost of the new service. We've included some cost for police enforcement activity, because there'll always be a proportion of people who simply won't cooperate, and it's important that the sanction of the court is imposed. But the greater part of the cost will be the administrative cost borne by the court service through its Enforcement of Judgments Office. That's something that at the minute exists. It enforces civil money judgments, and we're going to build on that business the enforcement of court fines and other penalties, other amounts. We think that's a much better way of doing it, because we're likely to recoup a much greater proportion of the total amount imposed by the courts each year. And then there will be other sanctions available before imprisonment, such as community service type orders. But the emphasis will be on getting the money paid that the court has ordered the offender to pay, and we would have opportunities to attach their earnings if they're in employment. We'll have also a power to deduct small amounts from benefits over time if they're on benefits. We'll have powers to freeze effectively a bank account for a period of time. We will also have powers available to the court to, for example, seize vehicles if they own a motor vehicle. So there's going to be a whole lot more powers available to get the fine paid. In the final analysis, though, there will be we reckon there'll be a stubborn number of maybe 500 a year who will have to go to prison, and we've costed on that as well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers, you wanted a supplementary?
Yeah, thanks. It was the point from Jackie earlier on. In your opening statement, Jackie, you talked about 60% of people pay their fines on time and whatever, and you hope that to continue. So would you break down the other 40% for me in terms of, how many people pay up either when the summons is issued or the cash payment when the warrant's issued? What sort of a percentage at that stage?
Okay. In the year 12-13, which I think is the year we're concentrating on for now, the numbers of people who paid up with no warrant or no enforcement activity were I should start off actually with the imposed figure, 49,610 fines imposed. Of those, 24,737 were paid at a value of £5.9 million, with no warrant, 2,812 paid to a value of 426,000 on foot of a warrant. So that was the total of actual money paid up. And then warrants and monies that were paid either with cleared otherwise. That means the judge has reconsidered the case and remitted the fine that was imposed. So it was 3,244 of those to a value of 434,000. Cleared otherwise, that's after a warrant has issued, so it might be that it was unenforceable because the person wasn't traceable, or they may have died, or something of that nature had happened. So cleared otherwise, after a warrant had issued, there were 2,075 of those to a value of £500,000, and the remainder then was outstanding at the end of excuse me, that financial year.
So, in answer to the first bit of it, really, we're only talking 50% of people actually paid up out of those 50,000.
There's another 10% that will pay once a warrant has issued in general.
Right. And out of what percentage would have served the prison term?
In the year we're talking about, at least 1,700 people were taken to prison by the police service in that final year, from the figure that we have. I don't know what that is as a percentage, but it is tomorrow.
There's 49,000, so 17.
Yeah.
Well, of the number of prison admissions, in 2012 there were 2,473 people admitted to prison for not paying a fine. 2,473.
Those receptions, some people might have been there more than once.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it could be, as Nick said, there could be somebody turning up on a number of occasions, but there were 2,473 fine defaulter prison admissions.
Could some of those relate to other years, though?
Oh, they could. Oh, yes. Yes, that's the problem with this.
So, and just on the same, Jack, what sort of targets, what sort of success criteria have been set year on year to try and improve those figures? Because they're not good.
Well, there are targets for the fine collection scheme that I mentioned earlier. There are targets around improving after the 50%, as you mentioned, 50% of people will pay up without any intervention or pre-enforcement activity. So once we've identified in the Courts and Tribunal Service those people who haven't paid by the due date, then those cases are passed to the fine collection scheme. And the fine collection scheme has been successful in getting payments in from another third, if you like, of the 50% that have been referred to them. So they will, so I'm just looking for the actual figures here that might be able to assist. We have had targets in place for some time for the fine collection scheme. They have 2 specific performance targets, and that is that after intervention by the fine collection scheme, it should result in 16% more debtors making payment. And the other target is that there will be a 26.5% reduction in the numbers of warrants issued to the PSNI, and both targets have been consistently been achieved or overachieved.
Right, so that's 16%. Okay.
Yep. And
thanks.
I should mention there's also a target in relation to timeliness of money paid over. Once the police service have collected money on foot of a warrant, there's another target in place to say that it should be paid over to the Courts and Tribunal Service within 15 working days.
But is 16% a challenging enough target?
Well,
Right, if we're talking about only 50% have paid up front?
Well, I think what we've found historically is there are people who can't pay and people who won't pay, and there will be a number of people who will persistently avoid paying no matter what the intervention is, even if it is after a police officer has arrived at their door to execute a warrant. So we certainly have been monitoring the targets, and say they have met, they have resulted in more money being collected that otherwise there would have been a fine warrant sent to the police for execution.
But, you know, as you review those targets and so on, what strategies have been put in place to reduce the figure who won't pay?
Well, if they won't pay and if they've refused to pay after contact from a fine collection scheme, then the next stage, pre the recent judicial reviews, would have been to issue a warrant, and they would have been told by the fine collection scheme that if they don't pay up or come to an arrangement to make an instalment order. And what we've found that increasingly fine defaulters will make arrangements to pay by instalments. I think I mentioned earlier that we'd seen a significant rise in the number of instalments orders. So every effort is made to intervene with that person and offer them different ways of paying their fine, whether it's straight off or by instalment. So there are interventions in place to encourage them to pay, but ultimately the only current sanction available is if they don't pay or engage with the fine collection service, then a warrant would have been issued. Under the new system or the interim system, until the legislation is changed further, they will be recalled for a default hearing. So a judge can consider how many days in prison they should serve for not paying their fine.
Sorry, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr Mackay.
Just a quick supplementary on Sean's question to yourself, David. You said 2,473
That's right.
prison
In 2012.
2012. How many days is that altogether?
It depends on the order in the individual case. There's a table in the legislation that specifies the amount of imprisonment you serve according to the amount of debt or fine outstanding. There's a sort of sliding scale. I just don't have that information with me. But they tend to be short admissions. I mean, those people are in prison just for a very short period of time. And one of the arguments the prison service would have is you can't do anything constructive with a prisoner who's only in for such a short period of time. You're really just giving them accommodation.
But obviously you would have figures. I wouldn't say it is a short period of time in each individual case, but you add all that together, it's a considerable cost. I mean, what's the average cost per day of a prison stay?
It's surprisingly low, the figures that the prison service have given us, and that's probably because they don't. The people are not subject to any sort of regime other than sort of custody and care. But there's no doubt that over this period the fine default prison receptions have been around 30% of all prison receptions, and if you can't do anything with the people when they're there, the Minister feels it's much better that they actually pay their fine or do a community service or something else that's actually worthwhile. Putting somebody in prison for a period of days or over a weekend, or as occasionally happens, is I suppose, symbolically important because the person has been seen to bear the sanction imposed by the court, but it doesn't achieve very much, I think.
The cost in 2013 was 65,000 on prison service figures. I think reference to that in the audit report.
Yeah.
65,000 in total?
In total, yeah. It's a remarkably low figure.
But it is simply the incidental, the incremental costs of admission and holding someone for a couple of nights and then releasing.
In terms of the JRs then, could you give us a bit more background to those? When were you made aware of the first JRs?
They were brought at the beginning of 2013, and the police appropriately stopped their execution of warrants at that point because we knew there were 5 challenges being brought. These were sort of
they all came at once, didn't they?
Test cases. Yes, it's a bit odd. They got clustered together. I think, I presume, a firm or firms of solicitors had identified a grounds for a legal challenge and brought together a number of cases that gave examples of the different things that they said were wrong with the procedure. The basic challenge was to the fact that, as Jackie explained earlier, up until 2013, the court, when it was imposing a fine, the judge at the same time made an order in anticipation of the fine going into default. In other words, if I was in court this morning, the judge would have imposed a £100 fine and said that if you don't, and allowed me so many days to pay the fine, and then would have said, and if you don't pay it, so many days imprisonment in default. And that was part of the court order at the outset. And although there were other aspects to the legal challenge, the fundamental problem the High Court said, or the Divisional Court rather said, when it looked at these cases, was that the court shouldn't be making the default order in anticipation. It should wait until the default actually happened. The person should then be recalled to the court to explain their circumstances. They should be given an opportunity to make representations, and then the court should apply its mind to what would be the appropriate sanction at that point. So we've had to build in this additional stage, which Jackie called default hearings. So now what happens, if the court imposes a fine today, the court will allow so many days to pay the fine, usually not less than 28 days, or it may be longer. Once that period passes, the fine is then passed to the Court Service Fine Collection Office in Derry. They then pursue the payment of the fine by sending out notices explaining that the period of imprisonment that will follow if the person doesn't pay the fine, and offering means of payment. They will do that on at least 2 occasions. That actually works, as Jackie said. We got significant improvements in payment rates at that point. It's interesting that people, when nudged to pay the fine, quite often pay. We got significant payments at that stage.
Just, in terms of what the Divisional Court recommended,
yeah,
why was this issue? I mean, you're always outlining the benefits of it.
Yeah.
Why was it not picked up by yourselves before that? I mean, is it the case that this is best practice elsewhere? It's been the conventional system. I mean, I practiced as a barrister in the early 1980s. That was the way this system has worked. Certainly since the introduction, I would think of the Magistrates' Court's order, which in my time dated from the 60s. No one ever doubted the ability of the court to make the order of imprisonment in default, but I guess we now have new considerations such as the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, and the court has said that procedurally it's no longer appropriate. So at the point when the person's been through the fine collection office and still hasn't paid the fine, up until the legal challenge, what would have happened at that point would have been the court service computer system would automatically have issued a warrant to the police to arrest the person and commit them to prison for the period of default. Now what we do instead is we issue a fine default hearing notice to the person. It has to be served on them personally by a summons server. Then a hearing takes place. If they attend, they can be legally represented. If they don't attend, provided the court is satisfied that they were served with the notice, then the court can proceed in their absence. At that point, the court then can impose an order for their committal to prison in default of paying their fine,
Or if the person turns up, they might be allowed more time to pay or give an instalment order. But we're finding that relatively few people turn up, and the court can proceed in their absence and generally then orders their imprisonment. At that point, then the warrant issues to the police. So I hope that wasn't too tedious, but that's roughly the legal challenge was the fact you couldn't automatically impose the default period at the same time as the fine. You had to have another look at the case once the default happened. It's built in quite a loop, quite a delay and more cost, but it's what the court has said we have to do. We will operate that system for a transitional period of about 2 years until the new service comes into operation.
And you see the way you were doing business in regard to that there?
Yeah.
Is that still the case in the south, in Scotland and England and Wales? I'm just trying to get a comparator.
That's an interesting question. In England and Wales and Scotland, they've introduced the system we're introducing now, which is based on civilian fine collection officers. The south still uses our system, and it doesn't perform as well as ours. You may not be hugely impressed with ours, but the one in the south seems to recover fewer fines again. But they have recently put through legislation through the Dáil to provide for a civilian fine collection service, but they haven't it operating as yet.
In terms of the new default hearing then, what are the resource implications of that?
Well, we've built in a cost of that, and it's about 1.8 million.
I think the additional cost to courts is about £200,000 a year, and then there's a £600,000 a year legal aid.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, I do beg your pardon. We've modelled on legal aid as well, but we're finding relatively few people actually attend with legal representation. So it's more, I would say, a cost of delay than anything, although it's an administrative burden on the courts to arrange these hearings. And we also bear the cost of having a summons server serve the default notice, although we recoup that then from the offender.
Jackie, can I just ask you a question in regard to the new fine collection and enforcement service that's to be introduced by the end of 2016? Interim measures have been introduced to comply with the JR rulings. However, these substantially change the enforcement and collection process and cast doubt over the accuracy of the impairment figure in the Trust 2012-13 statement. And the CNAG has qualified his audit opinion because you've been unable to provide assurance over the impairment figure. What's been done at the moment to address that particular point?
Yeah, well, certainly for 13-14, the finance team have been engaging with the Audit Office on impairment calculation. Obviously, the landscape has changed with the judicial review and the recall of the 30-odd thousand warrants. So until we know the actual outcome of that review and how many of those cases actually will be sent for enforcement and how many will be remitted, it's difficult to make an accurate estimate on the impairment figure. But we're certainly working with the Audit Office to make sure the methodology that we are using is satisfactory, or hopefully will be satisfactory next year. But it is very much a moving issue, because it will be dependent on the outcome of default hearings and on the review of the outstanding warrants.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mackay. Mr. Beggs.
Okay. My question's for Nick Perry, and I dare say to a degree the Assistant Chief Constable Mark Hamilton. Looking at the police estimates of the costs, it's been estimated at £3 million of police officers' time in enforcing the warrants and collecting them, and you've indicated that's based on the 24,500 warrants executed in 2012-13. You've indicated that's approximately £122 per warrant. How did you come to that figure? Where did the £3 million come from?
That was Mark too.
Again, these are average figures. Each warrant, we would make 3 attempts to try and execute. So that was part of the calculation. We looked at the average of the numbers of warrants, the numbers of attempts that we would make to calculate them. We have some figures as well around the amount of time that was spent in custody. As I said, around 42% of those we arrest then had an overnight stay. So there's a number of aggregate figures. I haven't got all the detail of every breakdown of that, Mr Beggs in front of me. I'd be very happy to provide that to the committee afterwards. But that was the figure that we aggregated in terms of the opportunity time the police officers spend in carrying out this function, from receiving the warrant, going out 3 times to collect the money, the processing then of the money, or the processing of the arrest, obviously then transport and taking the person to Magarbry Prison, lodging them there and so forth. So it's an aggregate of all. I'm very happy to try and get you a more specific breakdown if that was helpful, but I don't have that in front of me just as we speak.
I'm just conscious that in terms of a police officer's time, it's not a huge amount of time, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's a professional officer, what average hourly rate, you know, so do you think is it an accurate estimate, or do you think it's underestimated?
I think it could be both at different times, because certain police activity will take more attempts. So some people may have got 4, 5, 6, 7 attempts. They may have had, to use an expression, an agreement with the officer that they'll pay next week and come back the 3rd time or 4th time. These things were locally managed by local officers. And within that, then there would have been local attempts to deal with people. Some people would have known who they were going to and maybe said, well, we'll pay next month. So it's very difficult to be definitive. In other occasions, probably more in the city and so forth, people would have been just probably arrested a bit more quickly. The transport time, for example, the time involved transporting a prisoner from Londonderry to Magarbry Prison is entirely different to taking someone from Lisburn. So it's very difficult to give it an absolute definitive figure for every piece of police officer time. It's an aggregate figure based upon what we estimate to be the inputs of a police officer around the volume around which we were executing.
Turning now to the court sides of this issue, and again, I have it in front of my mind the issue of someone hasn't paid a TV licence at a cost of £145, and they end up in court. What would that court hearing cost? The very first court hearing.
I think I should write to you about it, Mr. Beggs. I'm not quite sure that it would be a departmental prosecution, but the cost of the court staff and the judge. But I'd be happy to write to you about it. But certainly,
can you give me a guess? You're going to have a guess.
Jackie, I think if anybody's in a position to guess, it might be Jackie, but I'm not sure if she's going to.
I think that there's a number of issues that raised. I think that others have mentioned earlier about trying to look at a criminal prosecution on a value for money basis and the amount of money it would actually cost to enforce non-payment of a TV licence. Certainly in terms of court time cases, there could be 20 or 30 similar cases listed in a court in any given day, but to make an estimate on one case, I would say certainly in terms of judge time and administrative time for one case, it certainly shouldn't be any more than £100. In fact, I would say it's probably significantly less. But again, sorry, just if I could just add, it will be dependent on if the person appears to defend their case or if the case is defended, and all those variables will add to the cost.
So the court time, roughly £100. They would be entitled to legal aid in many occasions. How much would that cost?
Well, I think we built in about £70 for default hearings, so I would say that's a good benchmark.
£70, and then a warrant has to be issued, and we've got a cost associated with that. Then there's now a default hearing where there's another £100, another £170, and then we move on. As I understand the current system, after 12 months, the police have to go back to court to get a warrant renewed. Now, I'm pretty much struck you didn't know the cost at the start here, because if we're bringing about change, it's important we know the cost of the system. So we're now bringing it back to court again a 3rd time. So is that another £100 and another £70 legal aid?
Just to pay the barristers.
Well, certainly wouldn't anticipate that fine default hearings would take possibly as long as the original prosecution in an individual case. But again, I would emphasise about if you're looking at criminal prosecutions and by type of criminal prosecution on a value for money basis, it may not provide figures that that the committee would be satisfied with. The intention is, and certainly through fine enforcement, the priority is to enforce the order of the court. And for some people that might be a very low value fine because the penalty is based on their means or on their individual circumstances in any given case. So it really will depend on their own personal circumstances and what mitigating factors there were in any individual case. But as far as the Courts and Tribunal Service authority lies, is to collect and a penalty imposed by a judge who in any individual case decided to impose a fine, and obviously to follow that through to enforcement if it's required.
Can you perhaps tell us the lowest value of a fine that all this could be triggered from? I'm just using an example of a TV licence, but what would be the smallest value?
£50 would not be an unusual fine. Certainly the vast majority of fines in the criminal justice system are under £500. There are some very high value figures in relation to confiscation orders and individual criminal prosecutions, but by and large the vast majority of fines are under £500.
And you've changed the system with this new default hearing based on a court judgment. Did you think of looking at a proportionate change, that, you know, depending on the value of the fine and the repayments, that it might be worth appealing and going to a higher court to get a different decision? Because it's costing huge amounts of money for this additional hearing. So did you consider that? And if not, why did you not carry that through?
I think the Divisional Court I think the Divisional Court included the Lord Chief Justice on this occasion, so I think it was an authoritative view. The additional cost for the court service in aggregate, we'll try and get you a figure for individual cases, Mr. Beggs. As I said earlier, I think it's $200,000 a year for the additional default hearings. These are temporary in the sense they are transitional arrangements, so they will last for a couple of years.
Yes, but meanwhile, there is huge costs and we are at significant financial pressures. And when I look at the speed of change that you've been planning, you know, this has been planned since 2008, changes afoot. And even today, you're talking about legislation next year and enacted at the end of 2016. Why does it take so long to save public money?
Well, in the case of these new arrangements, of course, the clock has been running since 2012 and the Minister's decision to move to this new model. The legislation we hope will go through in the course of next year, but once it's through, secondary legislation has to be enacted, and that's what adds the additional period.
Can this not be expedited or even interim legislation put through to save public money?
Well, in the short term at least, although the transitional arrangements increase the costs on the court service and some additional costs for legal aid, they actually reduce the opportunity cost for the police because fewer warrants are going to the police. So to that extent, when netted off, it's a slightly cheaper system, the transitional one. It is a more awkward system, there is no doubt about that.
Is the legal system living in a little world of its own? Yeah. You know, do you not appreciate the huge pressures that are on public services, and can you not expedite this change to make it happen faster?
This is the system that the Divisional Court has indicated.
So my question is about bringing in new legislation which the courts would have to act upon. Can we not bring about new legislation faster to save public money?
Well, at the moment, I think we hope, as I said, to introduce the legislation in the first part of next year, and that's subject to executive agreement, of course. We will get it through just as soon as we can.
Aside from these costs, there are costs in terms of prison, and I'll hand on to my colleague.
Yeah, sorry, just a supplementary here from Mr. Clark.
I suppose, Chairperson, we're going off in a direction where you could think that we're near the stage we should actually let people off, and I wouldn't want anyone listening to that getting the impression someone's guilty of a crime, regardless of how much it costs to prosecute them and get the fine. I mean, a degree of blame has to bear on the judges because sometimes they do seem to head towards the lower end of the scale. However, we could interrogate this to a lot of detail. One of the keys here as well, which is outside of the control of anybody sitting at the end of the table, is so more likely, and in many of the cases we see where the fines are even reasonably high, are legal aid, no means to pay. So we're getting buried in this whole cost implication in terms of, well, justifiable in terms of a £50 fine, but it costs you hundreds of pounds to get them to court. I think we should work on the principle that if somebody's broke the law, they should be in front of the courts. I don't think we should get into the blame in terms of how these costs have been arrived at. I think we should maybe portion more of the blame to the judges in terms of maybe being a bit lenient. However, in most of the cases, unfortunately, legal aid public money is paying for criminals anyway. But in terms of what the ACC said, I want to go back to him because it was £3 million. So whilst we're talking about costs, and I've put a caveat in there,
Yeah.
the offender should pay. I'm intrigued that you can't tell us today how the breakdown of the £3 million costs are, because you knew that you're bound to have known that that's going to come up today, how your £3 million's been calculated. And I suppose the sceptic in me would say sometimes the PSNI are guilty of putting out figures like they did with Tweddell Avenue, where the Chief Constable come up with £40,000 per night, but actually can't justify the cost.
Yes.
So throwing out headline figures with nothing to substantiate that is not always most useful. And what I would like to see, because the Chief Constable still hasn't come forward with the £40,000 per night for Tweddell.
That's another matter for
it
another
is,
day.
but it actually demonstrates sometimes the PSNI can use headline grabbing figures to try and maybe exaggerate the case. Because as Mr Beggs had said, in terms of the breakdown, it's £122 per warrant. Now that does sound extremely high in terms of police time actually serving a warrant. So really, I look forward. I mean, you lightly offered in terms of getting a look at those figures, but you have to have those figures, and I think we would, as a committee, would like to see those figures in detail.
Well, I apologise to the committee. It was not my intention not to have enough detail for you. I'd come here with the £3 million figure, and I apologise if that hasn't been sufficient for the committee. We will provide it for you. I take the member's point about PSNI costs.
Headline grabbing.
I've made the point on this specific one that we're not saying. I've made the point very clear that these are opportunity costs. They are not additional costs. There has been issues in the past about how we've described additional costs in operations. I haven't said that this is extra money being spent by the police service. We have tried to aggregate this out of the time of a constable. And this was a question we were asked, and this is how we have aggregated it. In terms of the breakdown of it, it is from the point of reception of the warrant, at least 3 opportunities in most cases to execute a warrant, the money then either recovered, brought back, deposited, receipted, and then or the person arrested, taken in a police car and deposited to prison. Those are the activities involved in fine executions by the police service, and that is built into an officer's daily duty.
Yeah,
it's not an additional cost.
It's not. It's just like Tweddell. It's not an additional cost at £40,000 per night. So the figure you have in terms of executing these warrants, officers would have been employed to be on duty anyway.
Oh no, absolutely. And
so sometimes I think, but I want to really get this across here. I want to get this point across, ACC.
Yes.
Sometimes you just throw out figures for the wrong reasons, and sometimes people get excited. In terms of the public, get excited hearing Tweddell's costing £40,000 a night, or hearing in terms of how much you're spending on an annual basis to retrieve warrants. But they're actually paying out that money anyway.
Oh no, absolutely. And I hope I didn't give you the impression at any point in my answer
you didn't.
that
This
was an additional cost. I mean, our officers are paid to do their duties. Every duty that we have is, you can apply some sort of costing to it. We are trying to make sure that what we do for the public now has more value for money than we would have done in the past. But I by no means are saying that this is additional. This is something that the police service, this is a function that the police service has been carrying out for many, many, many years. Yeah. As part of our, I did it myself as part of our daily duty. We've been asked to try and estimate the quantum of that. It actually would be easier to give the exact cost if it was additionality, because you could just add that on to costs. So I'm not trying to obfuscate around this at all. That's just the truth of it as I see it.
I'm letting Mr Beggs in here now.
Yeah, I just want to come back very briefly. Some people maybe have it in their minds about letting people off scot-free. I'm not. I'm about creating efficient means of dealing with fine defaulters. That's what I think we have to try and achieve.
Just
well done.
to be clarified.
Part of that, and I think just to clarify, when an individual comes before the courts, I mean, obviously there's a case prepared by yourselves who would be the arresting officers. The most common sense approach would be to find out what the individual's employment or income status would be, so that when it goes before a court, a judge would be able to make that decision whether this individual can pay X amount or not, or if it should be an instalment at the outset. So, I mean, that would be one of the most common sense approaches to take in the outset.
Yeah, there are means forms that defendants can fill in before they come to court to give information about their employment or their income, and there's also a facility available to the judges in court to look at the fine payment history of an offender. So when they are imposing a fine, they can review, there's an option for them to review the previous...
Is that a robust system?
Yeah, absolutely, it's available to them, but what I would say is that not every judge may access it in every case, but it is available to them.
But it would be something that a judge should be looking at. It would save the default and the extra cost to the taxpayer.
Well, certainly in terms of informing, having information available to the judge to inform the penalty imposed, that information is available to the judges if they choose to use it.
That's exactly. Sorry, are you actually saying, Jackie, that where there's history for the individual having no means to pay, the judge is going to let them off later?
I couldn't comment on any judicial decision in any case.
What you are saying then is that the judge has access to actually find out the history of the individual. So I'm saying it sounds like...
employment, I think, was employment or income status. Is that what you were referring to?
It sounds like there's an inference there that the judges are going to be more lenient just because the individual didn't pay the previous occasion.
What I said was there is information, if a judge chooses to access information in court, obviously after they have decided that the person is going to be convicted, not only do they get from the Public Prosecution Service, they'll get their criminal record to review prior to sentencing, but they can also review information that we hold electronically and can access it from every courtroom to say, was this person before the court on a fine previously? And did they have a fine imposed in that case? But what I would also say is there is an option to submit a means inquiry form to the court, and not many defendants will do that. And unfortunately, what we find is not all that information is not always complete.
Well, that's where the system needs to be strengthened, I think, at that point. Before, and you wouldn't have the mess that we have if that was a robust system in place, that the judge would have that information, that the PSNI would be able to collate that and bring it before, and it would be evidential, you know. So that's part of the system that's failing.
Chairperson, that wouldn't be surely the PSNI's function. Surely, I actually think the judge has too much access to some of the stuff. If someone's guilty of a crime, they should be scaled up rather than scaling them down. Just because they haven't the ability to pay doesn't mean you should be more lenient. And if they can't pay, I know it goes against the Justice Minister, but put them away. I mean, you have to get across the message that crime doesn't pay instead of rewarding crime. Simple.
Mr. Rogers.
I'd hesitate to enter into the debate.
I'm sure you would.
But I think Jackie did introduce, I mean, she's sort of disguising the fact that she introduced this idea of a payment record and so forth. So one of the initiatives the court service took under Jackie was to bring more information to the attention of the judge. I don't know whether they all use it, but I'm not sure that necessarily it's a good outcome to impose a fine on somebody who can't pay it. But it might
let
be
them off. You're basically let them off. But
it might be a good outcome to make maybe a community service order or something else that acknowledges their guilt. But to impose a fine on, if the court wasn't going to imprison them in the first place, but instead fine them, it's I think the minister feels it's slightly odd then, because they can't afford to pay the fine, they end up in prison. So that just doesn't seem to be entirely satisfactory, and that's why he wants to introduce a wider range of options that the court will have, and the court would be then expected to have regard to factors like the employment position of the accused, their record, and what would be an appropriate penalty. And we're introducing something called supervised activity orders to allow people to do reparative work in the community as an alternative sanction. But I also mentioned deduction from earnings, deductions for benefits. There's a lot more choice now. In the past, it used to be pay the fine or go to prison. We think it's better that there's more choice for the sentencer.
Before I let Mr Rogers in, it seems to me that when an individual comes before the courts, in my opinion, it's the judge gets the case and he sees Joe Bloggs, public order offence, urinated in the main street, £200 fine. And he doesn't look at the list beyond that. That's in my opinion. Mr Rogers?
Can we go back to being a fine defaulter? The client's a fine defaulter that they haven't paid up within 45 days. Is that right?
No.
And then it moves to the court service.
Whatever time the court allows, it's a minimum of 28 days, but people are sometimes...
No, but originally when I get my, when you get a fixed penalty notice,
yes,
you say 45 days to pay it.
Yes, fixed
right?
penalties, yes.
Then it's passed to the court service at that stage. You have another 28 days. Is there any incentive or is any penalty, my penalty the right word, is there any penalty placed on me because I haven't paid within the first 45 days?
Yes, your fine would be increased by 50% once it passed the court to be registered as a fine.
Right. And how well is that working?
Well, it would happen routinely in cases where fixed penalties weren't paid on time and public notice.
Penalty notices
for disorder, apologies. It would happen in those cases as well where people haven't paid their fine in the allocated time, then it's passed to the courts and tribunal service and registered as a fine, and it's inflated by 50% at that stage. So the incentive is if you pay up earlier, then you pay less, and if you don't pay, then you should be paying more. And again, that case would pass through the system in the usual enforcement process.
Okay. You didn't make a comment. I'm going on to the other end, to the prison end now. You said earlier about 6.1 million was pared off by spending time in prison, or something like that.
Yes.
In the report on page or paragraph 21, it states that it was estimated the cost to the Northern Ireland Prison Service of receiving fine defaulters into prison was around 150,000 per year. And then you suggested that the prison service suggested that figure had been reduced to 65,000. And we heard earlier that there was 2,473 committals. You know, that seems very, very little. We're talking about £30 a day, basically. Are these figures right? Because when you compare them with the Northern Ireland Prison Service, who say quotes about over 60,000 to maintain a prisoner for a year. Which works out it's £200 a day.
Well, both those figures come from the prison service, Mr Rogers. But the first figure, just to deal with that, the 150,000, they're calculated on different bases. So it isn't that the cost has reduced dramatically. It's just that the 150,000 figure was produced in 2005 and done on a very broad brush basis based on cost per prisoner place. The 65,000 figure, which is a total cost based on 2,000 prisoners, 2,000 receptions in 2013, is based on the incremental costs of accommodation, food for a short period, and the time, prison officer time in reception, in inducting them, if you like, into the prison. So it does seem like a low figure. I guess it's the minimum figure, but it's a more precise figure.
But how does it square with £32 a day versus roughly £200 a day? The prison service says it costs to keep a prisoner. The prison service talks about an average figure of 62,000 to maintain a prisoner for a year.
Yeah, but it comes back to the same point. These even if fine defaulters weren't admitted to prison, we would still be paying the cost of running the prison system as a whole. These are the incremental costs of bringing people on a revolving door, which is inefficient and disruptive. But in terms of the additional cost that it imposes on the prison service, it's more limited than one would think. The cost of the prison service is the disruption it causes to regimes.
Okay, that's
okay. Mr. Biggs.
You're just looking at the additional costs.
Yes.
We're about to build new prisons. Should you not be looking at the cost, the total cost?
Well, we are looking at the cost of prisons, but one of the aims of the changes we're bringing in next year is to prevent this constant flow of fine defaulters going to prison, the numbers we hope going forward will be very, very much reduced. And so in terms of designing or estimating the prison population going forward, we hope fine defaulters will be a small element of it.
But do you not accept that it would be more accurate to reflect the actual cost as opposed to just the additional cost?
Well, as I say, the costs produced in this report are the incremental costs. There is a cost per prisoner placed, and that 150,000. So the earlier figure reflected that, but it was slightly misleading in that if you stop fine defaulters going to the prison service, you wouldn't save that much money because the prison officers are there on duty on the landings, minding all the other prisoners at the same time.
But you might actually reduce the need for the number of prison service officials to be on duty at any one time if a significant change occurred.
There's just many more now if there's little enough of them.
Well, and certainly in future projections, the requirement for prison office staff is based on the future volumes of prisoners we expect to hold. So to that extent, it is being captured.
And those prisoners who are on duty would be able to concentrate on
they would
re-education and empowering people and hopefully enabling to better resettle subsequently.
I completely agree.
It's wings on their own at night.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Biggs. Thank you, Mr. Easton.
Oh, sorry. Hi. First questions to ACC Hamilton. Prior to 2012 March, why was there no basic routine reconciliation undertaken between the PSNI NEACH system and the integrated courts operating system to match warrants executed with payments received?
Well, there were ongoing reconciliation processes, but I think what certainly the process as in 11-12 exposed that it wasn't frequent enough, and that the corporate governance of the reconciliation process, certainly on the police side, in my view, having reviewed this over the last 2 years, just wasn't vigorous enough. So there were processes of reconciliation, and those have been going on really since this system started for many, many years. Various parts of that have fallen into abeyance. But that said, we have, over the last couple of years, been reconciling with the court service, and we're able to account for all the monies, but we're not carrying out a regular reconciliation process, and that will change. There will be weekly reconciliation internally with the PSNI, and then monthly reconciliation with the court service in the interim arrangements. But we just weren't robustly following the process.
Okay. Would you accept that the lack of basic controls has left the PSNI and NICTS vulnerable to the risk of potential frauds around the collection of fines?
Yes, I do. I do accept that, and that has been pointed out to me by the auditors. And as the person who detected the case that has been committed for trial, I do accept that. I know because I was the one who found it, and when we brought in our own internal audit process, following that we had a limited assurance, and we accept the findings of the Auditor General around the limited assurance or the assurance process as having control weaknesses. I can't avoid that conclusion is a correct one.
Okay. I don't want to get into that particular case because it's
I accept that.
How do you know there's no other ones?
Over the years, there have been allegations. We have looked at 5 cases in the last 5 years where there have been some sort of allegations around inappropriate behaviour, around monies, around warrants and so forth. That has led to one criminal prosecution, the one we're discussing at the minute. Okay. I'm aware of another case in the 90s, 2 cases in the 90s. We're not aware of any where there are physical monies missing that we can't account for. The issue that has been most pertinently pointed out to us is the issue of missing warrants, and also the issue of warrants that have been returned to the court because they couldn't be executed. And the question that has been asked of me is, can you guarantee that somebody didn't execute that warrant and then pretended that they didn't? In the interest of candidness and openness to the committee, I can't, back to 1981, give you a guarantee that in every case that didn't occur. I have no grounds to in police terms, reasonable grounds to suspect that crimes did occur, but we have had instances over the years of officers who have been suspected of, or in a couple of cases, being convicted of taking money. So, in auditing terms, the controls that are in place have been pointed out to us were not rigorous enough to drive out the suspicion that this could occur in auditing terms. I have nothing to support it in criminal terms, but that is clearly why we have to and have agreed to and are improving the level of assurance that we have in the system. It's, you know, to be honest, again, on a very personal point of view, from the person who found this last case, it's embarrassing for the Chief Constable. It's not acceptable to have this pointed out to us, because there's a huge element of trust here from the public, and a huge element of trust for the rest of the justice system in the police service, guaranteeing to the public that this function is carried out to 100%. So we take this matter enormously seriously, but I can't give this committee the absolute assurances in the same way that we couldn't give the Auditor General the absolute assurances, and that's why they have reached the conclusion that they have.
So you're accepting, what you're saying to me is, if I'm right, there's definitely been one case and there's been 5 investigated, but you can't 100% guarantee there hasn't been more.
No, I can't. I couldn't with any honesty state that.
Yeah, just before I let Tiger in here. You mentioned about warrants missing. How many warrants were?
The figure, I think, from the period is 6,682 warrants that can't be accounted for since 1981.
Well, that's
paper warrants, the physical warrant itself.
That's quite a lot, isn't it?
No, it is. I mean, that's set against a figure of an average figure of 20-odd thousand a year. We've averaged maybe 660,000 since 1987. But in the period under which the auditors have looked at the court services accounts from 1981 to the 2011 report, we are unable. The police service do not have a record of 6,682. 6,682 from 1981 to 2009, up until we went on to the Causeway system.
I think just to follow on in terms of the audit stuff. ACC, who in the organisation is responsible for your internal audit?
Internal audit. It sits. Well, I suppose it reports directly to the Deputy Chief Constable under our Audit and Risk Committee. So technically, it's the Deputy Chief Constable but the Chief Constable is the accounting officer for the police services accounts. These monies have never formed part of the police service accounts, but he's also the accounting officer.
No, but I mean in terms of so someone's responsible for the organisation, the internal audit function.
Yeah.
So there's a risk that had to be identified by external auditors in this case. Right. So why was the risk never identified by your own internal auditors?
Well, it was. Well, the risk was identified. This issue was raised with us through a reconciliation process between the court service and the police service in terms of warrants executed and monies received. We then asked our internal auditors, who are an external body, to look at that as well. That was sort of coterminous with the work that was being commenced, to my understanding, with the court service to compile their 2011 trust statement. So the two things were sort of in parallel, but we were aware of the issues arising, and we reported our suspected fraud to the auditor.
I'm not talking about obviously the particular case, and I'm trying to stay entirely away from that. I'm talking generalities here. But your own internal audit team, should they not have identified that there was a weakness within your own systems and controls?
Well, if we had asked them to examine...
No, you shouldn't have to ask them, because their function is to look at all the functions within the PSNI in terms of the audit process. So are you satisfied, given they didn't flag this up, that the right people are doing the right jobs within your own internal audit, within your own organisation?
Well, the internal audit that occurred was carried out by the external auditor contracted to us. Yeah. Each year we agree a programme of work with them. So this wouldn't have been on a previous programme of work. So this did not form part of the Chief Constable's accounts. And clearly that's a weakness in the sense that we weren't looking actively at this. I accept that. We weren't actively looking at this. We were looking at the other points of our own accounts for which the Chief Constable signs off to the Permanent Secretary. I think that's a problem for the court service because they are somewhere at the vagaries of the police service in terms of that, which is why since this happened in 2009, additional assurances have been sought from the Chief Constable on a yearly basis in the signing off of the court services account. So again, at the risk of keep saying everything was unsatisfactory, prior to these issues being ventilated by the Auditor General and by our own internal audit, am I satisfied prior to that we were entirely aware of the scale, scope and risks in the system? No, I wasn't.
No, nor am I trying to blame you. I would be putting that function and responsibility down to your internal auditors. So it was their responsibility to flag that up. But just in terms of that, so I'm not directing that at you, but in terms of the 6,000 odd warrants that aren't being, I mean, whenever Jackie was talking about it earlier, I was starting to think we have a Bermuda Triangle in Northern Ireland. These people are just disappearing off the face of the earth. But in terms of that 6,000, what work has been done in relation? So you've identified a weakness within the organisation. What work has been done in terms of those 6,000 odd warrants, missing warrants or missing people, in terms of, and I'm trying to stay away from the current case, but whatever problems has been associated with that, what has been looked at, whether that could have happened in terms of any of the 6,000 warrants?
We haven't carried out a criminal investigation in respect of those 6,000 warrants because we don't have a criminal suspicion around them. So, I mean, as a police investigator, and you come to a start point where you suspect a criminal offence has occurred, and that is where we are with the case that we could. So, as far as not as far as we're concerned, but as far as we can see at the minute, the auditors, and we agree with that, cannot rule out that fraud didn't occur. But equally, we have nothing to point to that fraud has occurred. We do accept that there clearly has been, in respect of those specific paper warrants, administrative failures or breakdowns somewhere in the system because we physically can't find them and have physically no record that they ever arrived. Now, we can make all sorts of suppositions and we have all sorts of hypotheses about why that could be, but short of something more substantial to look at, then no, we haven't carried out police investigations in respect of those 6,600 warrants.
In terms of how you carry out your function in terms of warrants, your counterparts in the mainland, do they do it in a similar way, or are they different?
Well, there's a different. They have a civilianised collection service.
They're entirely well, in terms of that civilianised, maybe I should direct that at you then, David. In terms of the civilian role, have you done any benchmarking against the 6,000 warrants per head of population in Northern Ireland or cases versus the number of warrants goes missing in the mainland?
I just haven't that information this afternoon, but we did extensive comparative studies of both the English system and the Scottish one. But I believe that there is almost certainly an impairment aspect to any enforcement system, but I will undertake to write to the committee giving
just in the back of what the ACC has said.
Yeah.
In terms of it's difficult to draw a parallel.
Yeah.
I suppose where some of us would sit in this, if there was an evidence base between England and Scotland, albeit they're civilianised, and the PSNI, in terms of the numbers of warrants that's issued and the number that goes missing, just to see if the Bermuda Triangle extends across the rest of the UK, or is it just Northern Ireland?
Yeah. Well, I undertake to write to the committee with the information that I can provide about the systems in England and Wales and Scotland, and we're looking particularly at the system in Scotland. But as well as the points Mark has been making, as Jackie said earlier, we've reviewed the greater number of the missing warrants because they're not missing from the court record. So we've reviewed the fine. We've done that end of it. Your conversation with Mark Subsidy about the physical warrant that they can't find, but
yes, but that weakness could also apply in other jurisdictions, whether it's a civilian role or a police role. What I'm trying to establish is if there was any work done, which obviously there's not been done in terms of England, Scotland and the comparison with Northern Ireland, regardless of who actually has the function, the warrants have been, I think the courts have been issued, but they haven't been delivered.
Some of the difficulty around that might be in getting an accurate comparison is that we are talking about a period from 81 to 2009 where and in 2009 we stopped taking paper warrants. So you know, I mean, I can't speak for England and Wales on this, but the comparison would have to be made at whatever point they've stopped taking paper warrants, and then a historic reconciliation back across the same period. I mean, this is roughly a 30-year period around these 6,600 warrants. So, I mean, I'm sure that the department will undertake it. I don't know if my colleagues in the police service around the 43 forces would be able to give definitively that comparison, but certainly we will try.
Well, the comparison I'm looking for is the period of time, the number of warrants issued versus the number that aren't served.
Okay. I'm pretty sure the similar issues were encountered in England, but rather than speculate, I'll write to the committee with whatever information I can provide.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Easton, do you want to continue?
Yeah, back to the warrants again. Okay. The 6,100 odd between 81 and 2009. Do we know who those warrants were issued to?
Yes, we do.
Have any of those warrants been paid? How did you know something?
Not to my knowledge, unless Jackie can.
No, we've know that they're still outstanding on court records. Therefore, as far as we're concerned, they haven't been paid. But what we are doing with a number of them are investigating with the prison service, because a number of them were forthwith warrants, so they should have been executed straight away. So we're investigating in a number of those cases. Did the person serve time in prison and the prison service didn't issue a committal receipt in a timely way back to courts to say this person was lodged in prison and served X days, or may have served their default fine warrant alongside another substantive sentence. So in every case, each case is being investigated to say what's the exact position of this warrant, is it still outstanding, should it be referred back to a judge to either decide to remit the amount of money or to issue a default notice and get the person hopefully before the court again to say your fine is still outstanding, it may be over some period, but at that stage what we found in some cases when the person is issued with a default hearing notice, they will pay up at that stage.
Okay, right, we'll go on. The next one's for you, by the way. Okay, would you agree that the risk of potential fraud would be reduced by having a process in place for monitoring warrants?
Well, absolutely. Any monitoring or any control enhancement, of course, in any system around cash collection is to be welcomed. I think what we have been doing is reconciling court records, whether they've been taken on through the introduction of a new IT system, and throughout that period we have been attempting to reconcile court records with police records in terms of outstanding warrants and monies due. So certainly our own internal audit, I should add, you questioned about the police internal audit, we have had recent and frequent internal audit activity in relation to fine collection, and we've had satisfactory, the latest report gave a satisfactory rating, but that's not to say you can ever be complacent around a cash collection system, and that's certainly about making sure that there are adequate and appropriate controls in place.
Yeah. Just quickly on this wee point before my last two questions, has anyone gone to anyone in the public to collect a fine for them to say we've already paid it?
Yes, that has occurred.
A lot, or?
Well, in the 5 cases I mentioned to you, that occurred in three times over the last 5 years, and 2 persons were arrested and then said, well, we have paid, and 1 person had attempted to make an arrest and they said they paid. So there have been, in the last 5 years, 3 investigations around that specific issue.
And they had paid?
Yes, they had paid.
How did, well, I'm not saying you specifically, yes. How did the police miss out that they paid?
Well,
you thought, yeah, they hadn't.
Well, there's two potential answers for that. One is just that the warrant process just wasn't properly reconciled. Okay, so that's the first thing, that the officer just didn't actually just perfect records appropriately. The other possibility, and this is what people point to, is whether or not the officer, or somebody took the cash and then just pretended that it hadn't been paid. So that's where there is a control weakness in terms of this. So that's, I mean, and this is part of the issue about, we've said at the start, and the auditors have also said that it's very difficult to guarantee out on the street 100% integrity around these processes where cash changes hands outside a controlled environment. That's why we have to be sure going forward that we have additional controls in place, so that, for example, there is no situation anymore allowed to where an officer would be executing a warrant on their own, that there are more contemporaneous records of when a warrant is executed, that's updated on our computer systems immediately, that there's a quicker follow through of the money behind that. And these are all the control issues that have been pointed out to us by our own auditors, by the Audit Office, to try and drive out these concerns. And because, as I just said to you, there's only two options when these things go wrong. Is it just someone has just made a mistake, and mistakes occur.
To interlude there, is there not an invoice system?
Yes, well, people should be issued with receipts, of course, and again, but again, when the auditors and our own internal audit looked across the system, they saw, in some cases, receipts not issued at the time, some cases receipts issued later. There's always the opportunity as well that an officer will execute a warrant almost on an ad hoc basis, because, for instance, would be, someone stopped in a car for something or other, there's a check done on them, and there's a warrant outstanding, and they hand the money over, and at that point, there's no receipt books or anything available. At that point, at the very least, an officer should be doing is recording the issues in their notebook and asking. So, I mean, we're looking at things going forward, such as, where we're on a different basis, we're piloting body-worn video cameras for other reasons, but contemporaneous, and this is very contemporaneous recording of all police activity whenever you do anything starts to try and rule out and flush out some of these concerns about whenever people have question marks about police activity. And these question marks arise not just around warrants at times, any area of complaints about police, where people are trying to assure or not assure what the police have done. So I'm trying to be very honest and candid with you here about the weaknesses about this, but that's where it stands.
Okay. I'm going on to have a choice between David or Nick. I'll go for Nick. How has the suspension and the issue of warrants impacted upon the collection of outstanding fines?
Well, it's led to a complete cessation of enforcement activity for a little bit over a year. It's recent in that from March 2013 until the courts started reissuing enforcement warrants in June of this year. We spent that time putting in place the arrangements that the Divisional Court had indicated that we should. But so the system is just cranking up again now. The flow of enforcement warrants is now passing to the police. The police will start enforcement action, I think, from very shortly, from next month. So it's too early to say really how effective it's going
to remind me, how many suspension warrants are there in this whole process?
The the court's recalled for review 32,000 out of 36,000 warrants that were outstanding. In terms of the revised list of warrants that are being issued by the court, I think David might have some figures for that since the process has restarted.
The numbers are still fairly low. As of this, we're now going into this default hearing procedure, so nothing. Courts are still imposing fines. People were still being encouraged by the Fine Collection Office to pay the fine, but at the point where it went into default because they hadn't paid the fine, no warrant could issue for about a year, so a backlog built up. But we resumed we started the new default hearing system
for the 32,000.
We started default hearings on the 26th of June. As of the 7th of October, we had issued 9,000, just over 9,000 default notices, of which 5,000 had a hearing date up to the 7th of October, and 22%, just over 1,000 of those 5,000 had satisfactory proof of service. Of the live figure up to the 7th of October of cases that the court could deal with was 1,116, and about 42% of those have been paid, and another 40% have gone for committal. So the system's now just, as Nick put it, cranking up, but the numbers are very slow at the moment.
Basic numbers out of the 32,000, we're on about 9.
Of the 32,000 reviewed, of the 36,000 reviewed, sorry, there were 36,000 warrants outstanding. The courts reviewed 32,000 because they didn't think they needed to review the other 4,000.
Okay.
And of those, I think they have remitted 40% in terms of numbers. So they've sent 60% in terms of numbers for default hearing. That's 70% in terms of value. So there's a significant number of warrants still to come through the system.
So out of the 36 odd or 32, whichever you're on, how many of those have you, well not you, but how many of those have been decided they're not going to go ahead pursuing them?
I think the figure's 40%.
So 40% are
Yes.
going to get off?
Of the back, well, there may be other decisions made. I think I suspect the courts are taking a view that if a warrant is fine is particularly old, it's unlikely to be recoverable. So there are some being remitted, but writing off is appropriate.
So 40% are getting written off, so those individuals are not getting any type of punishment at all?
Well, they may have received another punishment at the time they were convicted. They will have also received a criminal record of their conviction.
Yeah.
But I don't know, in some of those cases, the fine may not have been the only penalty imposed. There may have been some other penalty imposed at the same time. But there will inevitably be...
Their punishment really is 40% of those 36,000 is you've got a wee slap on the wrist and you're put on the computer. That's not paying your fine. But we don't know, because they're not fined.
No.
And you've no way of telling me at the moment that they've been put in prison for a day or two?
No.
They've got nothing really.
Of those, the 32,000 recalled and reviewed by the courts, as Nick has said, about 40% have been remitted by the court. Whether that's because of the age of the fine or some other circumstances to do with the individual, maybe even they could be dead for all I know. But of that number, there will be some who exactly come into the description you're giving us, that they were given a fine that they never had to pay, and it's been
So they've got off scot-free, basically.
Other than the conviction, the finding, the criminal record associated with the conviction. Other than that, yes.
That's really poor, isn't it?
Well, it's not what the criminal justice system would want to achieve. It is a legacy problem here, and it can only happen once. That's clearly an indication of failure of the system.
Can I ask you a different way, David? In your former life, you were a barrister. Okay. You represented someone. Would you pursue them for the payment, or would you just write those off?
Well, usually the solicitor was meant to pay me.
And would you pursue the solicitor for your payment?
Well, I think everybody would expect a liability to be discharged, and it's important that a criminal liability is discharged. And
well, that's only one aspect of it. I mean, there's a function in terms of the payment here as well.
Yeah.
And it seems to be the court service have neglected to actually follow that up to make sure that actually has been carried out.
Well, the way we would have looked at it, Mr. Clark, is we had two jobs to do in these cases up until 2013. If the court imposed a fine, we issued notice of that fine to the offender. We took payment in if they were one of the 50% who volunteered to pay, in other words, obeyed the court instruction. And at the point when the fine went into default, we then issued the other order made by the court, which was that they should be committed to prison for a period of time for default of paying their fine. So it may not reflect a very joined-up system, but I would have said our job was done when we issued the warrant of committal to the police service for execution. It was no longer a case of collecting a debt or a fine at that point. It was an instruction to the police to arrest and commit to prison.
So you're blaming the police then?
No, not at all. But it's a different type of order. It's not about collecting the fine at that point.
So who is responsible for the failure to bring in about £14,000 fines?
Oh, I think
Whose failure is it?
I think it's a collective failure of the system. There's
Well,
no.
just spell it out. Whose failure is it?
It is a
So
systemic
your
problem.
failure, Nick?
Well, it's a systemic problem.
No, I
think
don't want it. Look, no flurry language. Whose fault is it?
It is a design problem with the system. To be honest, in fairness to
And it's an old system.
If I could just put that figure of, sadly it's disappointing that we haven't got those. That
That's
footage.
right.
But in terms of scale, though, say over a 5-year period to 2013, something like 260,000 fines were handed down by the courts, or 270,000, I think. Half of those were paid without any further action. Fines are actually a very effective system, part of the justice system.
Except the 14,000 that got off.
Well, for sure, and we absolutely accept that that is not good enough. But
Definitely not.
But it does need that bit of context. I think helps frame that figure. But
As I described earlier, it flowers over it slightly.
Well,
there's 14,000 people. So, and I actually hear this from the police, and I have a degree of, I have a lot of sympathy for the police, because the police have a very difficult job. They apprehend people, and they would make suggestions what they would like to see happen. They take them in front of the courts. The courts are lenient on them. Then we give them fines, and then we let 14,000 of them off without paying their fines.
Well.
So it is really over to you, Nick. There's a failure. So you can talk about how many there was in total, but there was 14,000 people didn't pay. There's 14,000 people who may have records, which means nothing to them. There's people who have records probably could fill these pages. Means nothing to them. But the court service didn't pursue 14,000 people for fines.
The warrants were issued by the court service. The police have been pursuing with great diligence people who won't pay the fines. We have the issue here is we have a system that now, at a time of diminishing resources on the police side, which regularly has delivered somewhere between 23 and 25,000 enforcement warrants to the police every year.
Whose system is it, Nick?
It is the criminal justice system as it stands, and the department has responsibility to make sure that we have a legislative and operational framework in place that is fit for purpose, and that is why we're in the process of changing this one.
Go ahead.
My last question, you'll be glad to hear. I'll give it to you, David. Why could the PSNI only receive payments in cash prior to the suspension of warrants?
Why could they only receive cash payments?
Yeah.
I believe.
Why couldn't they take cheques or credit cards?
Well, I'm honestly not sure that there was any. It may be an internal matter for the police. I know the court service at the point when the fine was still current offered multiple ways.
Check would have. The risk of being wrong, but a cheque would have been acceptable, obviously, with the proper assurances. It could no longer be acceptable because you can't get the same assurances around cheques. But certainly, there was no alternatives to a cash or a cheque transaction between the police. But at the risk of being wrong, a cheque could have been acceptable.
Depends on the guarantee, certainly.
It was to do with the guarantee. You know, if an officer had felt that that they could take the guarantee with the cheque card and so forth, again, we're back into.
It's another offence to write a cheque without having sufficient funds.
Well, of course. So I mean, it depended upon the person having the funds. There's a risk there for the police officer, and I suppose the police officer could. Again, in some areas, in some parts of Northern Ireland, officers may have known families better or whatever, and accepted it or not. But generally, cash was the accepted way of a guaranteed way of clearing your fine.
You're making me think there again, ACC. Some areas, it's a bit like the 6,000 warrants that went missing. Maybe some areas that actually didn't want to issue warrants.
No, it's not even that. I suppose just whenever I sometimes answer these things, I think about my time as a constable and in various parts of Northern Ireland, and our warrant officers who engage with local communities. And I don't mean that in areas in terms of the troubles or anything else. I just mean we had different relationships. Certainly in rural areas as opposed to in Belfast and so forth, people knew each other better and so forth. So, I mean that's just me reflecting on police,
your experience. But I suppose, even again, if checks had been done, received, and hadn't been honoured, well, then sure the payment of the fine wouldn't have disappeared either. No. So the fine would still have stood.
Shouldn't have, no.
So it does seem strange, even without the guarantee card, that they still wouldn't have taken the...
Again, in most of myself, I was saying in the vast majority of these cases, it was always cash. There would have to be a lot of assurance around it.
I forgive me, I don't want to, I'm rashly reopening the conversation with Mr. Clark, but
go for it.
The court service saw its job as giving effect to the orders of the court. We didn't see our job as collecting debt. We saw our job as issuing a notice that this offender owes this amount of money as a fine, and it has to be paid within so many days. That was our first job, and we introduced the fine collection office.
So who suspended the 32,000?
No, but what we want to say...
No, just sorry, because you're trying to qualify how wonderful you are, but in terms of 32,000, who suspended those?
They were suspended as a result of a court challenge.
Yeah, by the courts.
But no, but
because I wouldn't want you to try and pass the blame to the PSNI at this stage.
No, my point is that at the point when the fine went into default, the court service's job was to issue a warrant for the committal of that person to prison. Now, I understand why this is a failure to collect a fine, but we were giving effect to the order of the court, which at that point was commit the person to prison. That we saw our job as that. Now, maybe it wasn't the right way to look at it, but we saw our job was, at the point when the fine went into default, our job was to issue a committal warrant for the committal of that person to prison, and if they paid the fine in order to avoid going to prison, that was recorded, and that was a way of discharging it.
So who actually gave the instruction to write off, hold back, whatever you want to call it, the 32,000 fines?
The instruction to cease execution of outstanding warrants was jointly made by the court service and the police service, because we knew the divisional court had said to execute those might be unlawful. So we jointly decided, as soon as we got the judgment of the court, to stop them. Then the court service, that is, recalled the warrants, and arranged with the judiciary to review all of the 32,000 outstanding warrants.
And in terms of the 14,000 that you referred to earlier?
The judges then remitted roughly 40% of them and said that they shouldn't be pursued further.
For what reason?
Well, I speculate it's...
It hardly could be because they suffered awfully at the hands of the fine that they didn't pay.
I would say it was I would say it was the age of the fine. I would say they had regard to the fact that the divisional court indicated that there was a sort of limited shelf life after which it would be perhaps less appropriate to pursue a fine. So I think it was as much to do with I would suspect if you looked at this, you'll find that most of the remitted fines were the smaller, older fines.
See, in terms of, so with the 32,000 went down to 14,000, and they never were served, do those individuals still believe they owe the money, or did they receive letters to say they don't owe the money? There's been an awful lot of conversation about letters, and
they would have been notified at least by the court service that they owed a fine and had to pay it, and they would have no reason to think that they don't still owe it. I don't know that there's been any.
So they've never been informed they still don't owe it?
I'm just not sure, Jackie. Did they get any communication about remittal?
No, not after the remittal, but they certainly, if they had appeared in court at the time, obviously they would know when they appeared in court what their conviction was and what the penalty was. But they would, even if they had appeared in court, they would still get a fine notice saying you have to pay whatever the amount is within X number of days, and if you don't pay it, you will go to prison in default for a number of days. But as David said, once the divisional judgment was given that basically said that any warrant that was outstanding was potentially unlawful, when at that point police and court service agreed to halt enforcement activity, and Courts and Tribunal Service asked for each warrant to be recalled for consideration. The gap between the 32 and the 36,000 that appears in the report is there were a number of forthwith warrants, which I think I explained earlier, that we're investigating with the prison service to say, did these people actually serve time in prison, because they should have had those warrants executed immediately. But certainly in relation to if someone has a fine remitted, they don't get a notice out to say the judge considered your case and your fine has been remitted. And as David said, the judgment was very clear in saying that any warrant over 12 months should be considered as aged and be subject to review. That doesn't mean it won't be reissued, because a number of these cases we know are going to have to go through the default hearing process and potentially hopefully some of them will pay. If not, then they'll have a default period set so that when a warrant does issue, it'll be very clear about the amount of time that they have to pay in default.
Jackie, just correct me if I'm wrong, because and I hate jumping to the defence of the police in this one, but everybody tries to tie them into 32,000. Going back to David's explanation earlier, so basically the courts pay fines. You hand it over to the police to actually collect the monies. I find it difficult to comprehend that the police would say, we don't actually want to do this anymore. Surely it would have been an instruction that you have found out that 32,000 may have been unlawful, that ACC and his team decided, oh, fine, take them away back. I mean, I can't imagine they were actually part of the decision-making process to say they do not want to collect the fines.
I think everyone here, all the witnesses here, understand and agree that under the current legislation, the only people who could execute a warrant and follow the direction of the court were the police service. I think also everyone agrees.
But on the court service direction, of course.
Well, it's really on the direction of the judge who imposed the penalty and the default period at that point in time. But what the divisional court said, that simply assuming the maximum default period for each of those offenders wasn't Human Rights Act compliant, so that each of them would have to have a hearing before the court to say, in your current circumstances, is the fine still a valid penalty, and what is the period of imprisonment you should serve for not paying it. But ultimately, once the warrant had issued, it was in the hands of the police. And I think, as everyone, nobody's trying to blame anyone else here. It is as it was. It was for the police to decide what resources it was able to deploy to that activity. And I think the 36,000 warrants have built over a significant period of time, as Mark said. Some of them are very old, date back to the 1980s. And they each had to be subject to review, and many of them have been remitted, but simply because of the age of them. To try and pursue a warrant that's 30-odd years old is not necessarily an appropriate thing to do.
I'm just picturing this, there's about 36,000 people sitting at home tonight, biting their fingernails, just waiting for the police come to collect that fine. No. Is that what you're saying? Even though they didn't bother their backsides trying to pay for it in the first place, when they knew actually they'd want to pay?
Well, I don't think they would be, because they haven't engaged in the following their penalty, following them having a conviction. They haven't engaged up to now.
I've been facetious.
But the important thing to bear in mind is that apart from the fines remitted by the court, we will continue to pursue all of the outstanding fines, and when we set up the new system, if we haven't cleared the backlog, it will be docked in eventually to the new system. So we're not abandoning these.
Except the 14,000.
Well, they've been remitted by. That's a judicial decision, Mr. Clark. I can't explain it further than that. The judge has reviewed the fine, taken into account the factors that Jackie mentioned, and has remitted the fine, and that's a judicial decision, and it's not for me to question it. It's for me to give effect to those 60% that the judges have said should be pursued, and we will see that that's done.
Thank you. Mr. Easton, are you finished?
No. Back to the figures. Although I was finished, but I'm back in again. There were 4,000 out of the 36 you were looking with the prison service to see if they'd maybe locked up for a day or two or whatever. Is there the potential out of those 4,000 that people may have been meant to have gone inside for a few days and maybe haven't?
Well, because we're forthwith, they should have been executed straight away, either at the court or in prison, because sometimes what happens is defendants will get a substantive prison service, and then if they know they have outstanding fine warrants, they'll ask for them to be executed at the same time as they're serving their substantive sentence. So it may be that we're reviewing with the prison service what their records show in terms of was that person in prison at that time that the forthwith warrant was issued. So we're looking at each of those individual warrants as well to see exactly where the records are, either with police or prison service, and the status of those warrants.
Okay, but we're talking about 4,000 individuals. So
I don't think we are, Mr. Norman. The gap between the 32,000 and 36,000 isn't just forthwith warrants that might have involved prisons. I think it's rather less a number than that, less than 1,000.
It's less than.
There is a figure in the context of the missing warrants. I think, the 6,600, a number of those were forthwith warrants, and I think about 1,000 of those, these are the warrants that we thought that the police might have had. Actually, about 1,000 of those are what they call forthwith warrants, where people are committed straight from court to prison. So in that context, there are checks going on with prisons. But there aren't 4,000. The gap between the 32,000 figure and the 36,000, the reason the courts, as I understand, and Jackie will correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't review all the recalled warrants because there was already a variety of actions taking place in respect of those warrants, so they didn't need formally to review them. I think that's right, Jackie, isn't it?
Yeah, the actual breakdown of warrants not recalled is 3,809. Of those, 2,230 were forthwith warrants. 475 had an indication on the record that they had been executed by arrest. A further 1,005 been executed by payment to PSNI or committal to prisons. That means that some may have paid, but the payment hadn't been processed through the system yet. And there's a further 99 that we're currently querying with prisons and police service.
So there's a bit of a breakdown maybe as well between the PSNI and prison service in terms of records as well. Would that be fair to say?
Well, there's some joining up of some reconciliation still to be done on these outstanding warrants about just which ones sit precisely where.
Okay. Just one very last question. Was any of this raised with the Justice Minister? Was he aware of all this? And did he give his blessing about these warrants being done away with? Was his opinion sought?
Well, he was certainly aware of the divisional court ruling and the impact that would have, and of the decision to recall the warrants, which I'm sure I know he thought was the right thing to do. Of course, the actual decisions on what to do with those warrants then became a matter for the court.
Yeah, but he was aware of the 14,000 that were going to be written off totally?
Well, he was aware that they were going to be reviewed by the court, and he's aware of the outcome of that, but he has no input to that decision. That's a matter for the court.
And he chaired, Mr. Easton, he chaired a meeting of the Criminal Justice Delivery Group. That's the group that brings together the Chief Constable, the Lord Chief Justice, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Attorney General. He chaired that on the 25th of September, at which the group discussed the implications of the judicial review, and also he authorised the preparation of an urgent bill to allow us to start these default hearings. It turned out we didn't need to use the urgent bill. We found another way of doing it administratively. So the Minister's senior group gripped the issue quite quickly.
Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Girvan.
Thank you. Appreciate we've focused quite a bit on the history of where we are now and what has actually happened. And I want to look at what has happened and where we're going to go. And there have been a number of consultations held in relation to this matter: 2008, 2011, 2014, and as a consequence of all of those, we are still dealing with what is an archaic system, which doesn't seem to have moved with the times. I appreciate that. I don't know whether any of you have been to America, where you've incurred a speeding fine at the side of the road, where they will take your credit card and take the payment there and then, and that's how it's dealt with on many occasions. But
you declaring an interest, Paul?
I'm not going to say very much about that. But all I will say is that these are the types of archaic process that we have, and I'm just wanting to know what is the reason for the delay in reform, and I'm wanting to know, can you ensure that the target date that has been mentioned here of 2016 will be met, and if it's not, if it is going to be met, what mechanism have you in place to ensure that it is met? I appreciate that, yes, whenever you mention legislative change, you always can make it sound like it's going to take forever, but I appreciate that there are ways of actually putting things on an order paper to get it dealt with and getting legislation brought forward. And I'm just wondering what work has went on through the Justice Committee to ensure that we have this brought forward by the Minister for Justice as an urgent matter. Because I think, back on what Trevor said earlier, 2016 seems a long way away, and I always try to relate things to how it would happen if it was your own business you were running. You would definitely not be doing it the way we've done it. And how are we sure that we're going to close the loop between what happens at the jail, what happens with the PSNI, and what happens at the courts, to ensure that there is a clear process? You know, you can walk into a corner shop and pay a bill for an electricity bill, and that will appear. How are they linked? Your corner grocers can be linked directly through to a private company that are receiving payments from thousands, not maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and they can deal with it quite effectively, and it appears on the day, on time. And I want to know what mechanisms are being put in place to ensure that that all happens.
Well, David, can maybe speak a little bit of the detail of the reform programme, just to cover the point you're making, Mr. Governor, about the slowness of reform. I'll just go back to what I was saying earlier. 2011, the Minister authorised the issue of this consultation document, which had been approved by the Criminal Justice Delivery Group, and therefore had the buy-in of all the senior leaders in the justice system. And we've been working to implement that decision over the last couple of years, and we are hopeful of getting the legislation introduced into the Assembly next year. So there is a lot of work and a fair amount of urgency going into this. This is a strategic objective for the department and for the minister, and the new arrangements. And David, as I say, can talk about the specifics about payment arrangements and all of that. By bringing more of the enforcement process under the court service, it will simplify the accountability issues that you touched on there, because the police involvement will be much reduced in the kind of money collection aspect of fine collection. Yep. Since devolution, I think with respect, it wouldn't be entirely reasonable to say we've moved slowly. We had the report by the Criminal Justice Inspectorate in 2010, which coincided with devolution, and that was basically a challenge to the system to fix it. The consultation paper in 2011, which the Minister published, was to explain that the move to a civilian form of fine collection to relieve the police of that responsibility. The further consultation in 2014 was because we thought additional powers might be of assistance to the fine collection service, such as seizure of vehicles and so forth. So we've done extensive and have now completed extensive policy consultation, including in discussion with the Justice Committee. We did lose about a year because of that judicial review, that legal challenge. 2013 was just a lost year. We put all of our effort into establishing a fine default hearing system. And as I say, the people who would have been working on the legislation for the new fine collection service had to work on the preparation of an urgent emergency bill, because we thought we might need urgent legislation to allow us to have default hearings. We actually brought a judicial review ourselves to get clarification of the law, and we found an alternative way of introducing fine default hearings. But 2013 was really spent going round in circles to try and get the system working again. We now have, beg your pardon, we have the Minister's announcement the previous year, 2012, was to introduce the new arrangements. And once we got the system up and running again after the interruption in 2013, we have been developing the instructions to the legislative drafts people, and we are committed to introducing and completing the enactment of a fines and enforcement bill during this Assembly mandate. So we have to get this done by March of 2016. There will then be a bit of secondary legislation that will have to go through, and you can only do that when the new Assembly comes back in 2016. And that's why we
Can I ask why you have to wait till the new Assembly comes back in 2016?
Well, we don't think we would not have the secondary legislation through the Assembly in this mandate. Well, it just wouldn't work. You're not allowed to introduce, as you know, secondary legislation unless the primary legislation gives you the power.
I appreciate that.
So it's a sort of sequence you have to go through, and we calculate it. We'll have to do this in probably the autumn of 2016. But our plans is for the new fine collection service to be operating at the end of calendar year 2016. And then the other point you raised was digital delivery channels, forms of payment, all of that's being planned for, because clearly this idea of paying money or cheques or even postal orders is really archaic.
It really is.
And although we have to allow, I think, also for the fact that a proportion of people who come into contact with the courts may not even have a bank account. You know, there are people who will will have to take cash if that's all is on offer.
Totally appreciate that,
Yep.
but many of us have been in a position where you've seen somebody say, well, look, I need to order an airplane ticket, and they're sitting in an airport, and unfortunately they phone a friend here, and
Yes.
they get they sort it out with them.
Yes.
It's between them and them
Yes.
to sort it out.
Yes.
Can I ask, if this process is going through and will make all these wonderful changes, how will this new fine collection process, what's your model? What model do you see working there?
Well, we're modelling this on the Scottish system, which seems to work quite well. The court bit will still look the same. The person, if convicted of an offence and a fine imposed, at that point, the court will also make a collection order. That will be an authority for a collection officer employed by the court service.
Does that take away from your previous comment where you mentioned to Trevor, or to Trevor earlier on, where once we have set
Yes, that's exactly the point.
Because
Yeah.
I did think that was somewhat a washing your hands process, which I disagree, because if you put in place a charge, it's up to you to ensure that charge is collected.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, it wasn't really ever acknowledged as the court service responsibility to enforce orders of the court.
But I think yes, the law tends to follow very strict controls,
Yeah.
but in a common sense approach,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
maybe is not so common.
Well, that's the key difference. This new system will mean that the court service will be responsible for collecting the fine, not the police for arresting and possibly collecting the fine. So we will have performance targets for
Yes.
the fine collection service. We'll be able to account to this assembly or to the committee for the our delivery against those targets. So the whole system will make it our job to collect the fine. And if the collection officer cannot secure the payment of the fine, then the collection officer will bring the person back to court, and the court then will impose an appropriate sanction. That could still be imprisonment, it could be a supervised activity order, it could be a seizure of the vehicle. There will be a lot of additional powers available. But you've hit the nail on the head. The change will be, it will become our job explicitly to collect the fine and to set targets for that.
I'm quite happy to hear that, and I think that ties in line. Now, the other model that you have alluded to within your seizure of goods, so are we going to have a similar process? And this is to link in, and this brings me, because other jurisdictions have undertaken this type of work and are doing it. Some are doing it very effectively, and others are not, but they use the process of bailiffs. Is there a possibility that there's going to be the introduction of the bailiff process similar to what we have in other regions of the United Kingdom?
Well, we, as you know, don't have a bailiff system in Northern Ireland. We have an enforcement of judgments office run by the Courts and Tribunals Service, and they're in the business of seizing goods and property to discharge judgment debts. That's why we think the fine collection service that were introduced should be based on the enforcement of judgment service, and they have powers to seize goods at the moment, and they understand how to do that business and are relatively successful at it. So things like, I mean, the range of...
You did say there they're relatively successful at that. By comparison to what happens in other regions, how successful are they?
I would find it difficult to give you a comparison because we don't know, no system that I'm aware of recovers 100% of the debt. And some people criticise the Enforcement Office for being maybe a wee bit too compassionate, because they are dealing with some very difficult situations. For example, they're responsible for seizure of property, you know, and repossession of a property is a very emotive thing to put somebody out of their property. I think it's appropriate that we don't go ram-stam at it, that we find out, have the alternative accommodation and things like that. But they are an effective system for enforcing court civil judgments, and we think they're the right, because they have that expertise, we think they're the right people to collect fines in the future. So I'm pretty confident, based on what I've seen in England and Wales and Scotland, that this is a better model. There'll be no lack of clarity about whose job it was to collect the fine. It'll be the department's job through the court service, and will not have this ambiguity, if you like, that maybe has characterised the system in the past.
But should someone default where you have to use the services of the police service to actually arrest?
Yes.
That
remains part of the model, because there will always be people who, it's not that they can't pay, they won't pay.
Yeah.
And the court will then be able to make a committal order for them for imprisonment, and that will remain the responsibility of the police to arrest them and take them to prison.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Girvan. Members, Mr. Girvan was the last person to ask questions. Does any other member have anything to add? Mr. Biggs.
Yeah. I want to go back to a question that was answered by Nick earlier, and he said that nobody was at fault, it was a design fault. Nick, you're in post, I believe, 4 years, and David, as the director, for about 3 years. Why has new legislation not come forward sooner?
Because, as I said earlier, Mr. Biggs, the Minister decided in 2012 that this was the model he wanted to pursue, and we've spent the intervening period designing the model and are working on the legislation. That's why we haven't got it in place yet.
2 years?
Well, it does take that time. We have also activated, of course, on a pilot basis, the supervised activity orders in the meantime, but it does take that time. Right?
And the case, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but the judicial review, we lost a year. It's just, that's a fact, that happened. We took a whole year to get the system up and running again because of the judicial reviews. So
could this not have happened concurrently, that somebody was planning the new system?
There's a limited resource in the department. We have a small team of policy and legislative of experts, and they're also working on things like, the Bamford mental capacity legislation. They're working on the
Can I go back to the problem having been highlighted in 2008, and indeed the enforcement of fines report in March 2010 by the Criminal Justice Inspection. This didn't just suddenly start in 2012. Why has it taken so long?
Because devolution happened in 2010, the consultation...
But you didn't need devolution. This could have started and devolution could have continued it.
But these decisions were required to be taken by the new Justice Minister, and the consultation document he approved in 2011, after consulting other leaders in the justice system, drew very valuably on the Cegini report of 2010.
And it's also important to bear in mind that consultation paper in 2008 that was published by the Northern Ireland office said very explicitly decisions on this in the future will be for the devolved administration, because by 2008 we were pretty well anticipating the devolution of policing and justice. So they set out a range of policy options, but said it would be for the devolved Justice Minister.
Starting to look forward then, the direct withdrawal of money options via the courts, where money could be withdrawn from salaries, from wages, from benefits, vehicles could be seized and access could be made to bank accounts. That would save millions of pounds to the police. It would save millions of pounds to the court service. It will save millions of pounds to our prisons. Certainly at the moment, the police service are facing drastic cuts which will impact on the public. So my question is, how can you justify waiting another 2 years before this impacting on the ground?
Well, I just would not be possible. It wouldn't matter how many staff I had.
Can you explain why it will not be possible?
Well, the legislation has still to be, the instructions are with Legislative Council. They estimate it will take a number of months to draft the legislation. When it's introduced into the Assembly then, it's referred to the Justice Committee. I think it's it's just a fact of life, but the first thing a committee does then is publish a draft bill for 3 months consultation. So we have to wait for that period of time, and then the committee begins the detailed consideration of the bill. Our estimate is, and we've discussed this with the Chair and Deputy Chair of the Justice Committee, is that it will take us probably to the end of this mandate to get the primary legislation through. We will have people preparing the secondary legislation in tandem with that, but we'll not have enough Assembly time to get that introduced until probably September 2016.
Is there any way of speeding up the process and avoiding accelerated passage? Because I'm not wanting that. But 2 years, we're still a considerable, at least 18 months in this current Assembly is left. I'm shocked that you think that you cannot get primary legislation and secondary legislation through in that time.
Well,
in times of emergencies, people generally find there are ways of doing things. We're in a room which was an operational room during the Second World War, where suddenly new thinking emerged and things that were impossible became possible. In such a situation, with the dire consequences that are facing us, can you see this being expedited in a manner which will still follow normal parliamentary procedures?
I think the timescale I've given you, although it's not obviously to the committee's critical of it, I think is the irreducible minimum time that will be necessary. You're quite right to say that when something has to be done quicker, it can be done quicker, but we're designing a system for the next 20 years, and I think it will require that amount of time to go through the legislature.
Yeah, just picking up on some of the early comments from Paul Gervin, where he said that if it was a private business, that this would not be the way it's done. If you, and perhaps many of your staff, may be losing their jobs because of a lack of funding, would you be able to perhaps find a way of moving it forward quicker?
I'm not sure quite how to address that. We have...
I'm being serious. There's huge cuts in public funding. How do we make good use of public funding and ensure that we have good governance?
Well, that's maybe a permanent secretary question, but I would say that the Justice Committee and the Justice Department have got the busiest legislative programme probably of any part of the devolved administration. In the remaining 18 months of this mandate, we are committed between the committee and the department to enact the Faster, Fairer Justice Bill to speed up the justice system and improve services for victims, to enact the Fines and Enforcement Bill that we're discussing this afternoon, and also to enact, through a joint committee with Health, the Mental Capacity Bill. Those are three huge bills, and all in 18 months.
Have you prepared a business case for Invest to Save application for funding? Because there's meant to be Invest to Save funding. This would strike me as being an area where money could considerably be saved if it were expedited.
I wouldn't know how to expedite it, Mr. Beggs. If you gave me a lot of money to hire more staff, it wouldn't change the reality of the legislative process, and that, frankly, is what's going to dictate the pace of this.
So the Assembly dictates the legislative process, much of it?
Yes, but it's appropriate that the Justice Committee gives detailed consideration to what will be a complex piece of legislation. When we consulted them on the policy, they were quite happy with, for example, deduction from earnings, but some of the members of the committee have concerns about the appropriateness of deductions from benefits. We think that is appropriate, and we will be arguing for that. But it's better, I think it is appropriate that the Justice Committee, on behalf of this Assembly, gives detailed scrutiny to the legislation, because we'll live with it for the next generation once it's on the statute book.
The committee session is normally 6, maybe 8 weeks. It's not 2 years.
Well, the first thing they do, as I said, is they publish the bill for 3 months public consultation, and that you just have to wait for that to take place. But we have discussed the scheduling of this with the Minister, discussed it with the Chair and Deputy Chair, and we have I can show you the chart. It's like landing planes.
Is this before or after the emergency situation that has emerged regarding our financial situation?
I think it's unlikely that that's going to have a bearing on this. That will undoubtedly have a bearing on the size and shape of the Department of Justice in 2015, 16 and beyond, and that's something which all of us are grappling with. But I think we will deliver this bill. If it's the will of the Assembly that we deliver this bill, we will have it on the statute book. But I can't offer you any assurance that it can be expedited beyond the timescale I'm suggesting, and that's based on considerable experience. I've been doing legislation for 30 years, and that tends to be. And I'm always doubtful when people say it'll take 2 years to do something. I want it done in 1, but I am absolutely convinced what I've given you this afternoon is a realistic and deliverable timetable.
It's a great pity it wasn't started sooner.
okay.
Okay, Mr Biggs, thank you. Members, we've now had the opportunity to question our witnesses here today. I have one final question to you, Mr Perry. The committee did note that despite the fact that there were serious consultations going back to 2008 and 11 and 14, which provided opportunities at that time for real reform, very little has happened, as has been said here today, in the way of reform. But just in final, and what assurances can you give this committee that this will not be another missed opportunity? And indeed, where does this sit with the Department of Justice legislative programme? Is this a priority within that?
Well, you have our collective assurance, Chair, that this is a key strategic objective. As David has just been saying, it is our firm intention to get the legislation through in the lifetime of this Assembly. That's what the Minister has directed. We recognise the weaknesses in the current system. We think we've got a better model, and we want to get it in place as soon as possible. And as David's discussion with Mr Beggs has just explained, we're working quite hard to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Just finally, I'm just bringing back my old business hat here. Does all of this require legislative change? Is there any of this that we can be brought about as effective just as improvements about processes without requiring legislative consent to actually do that in certain areas? I'm not saying not to go down the legislative approach, but I'm saying, are there areas where we could actually make tweaks around the edges of this to improve it as and of now without using the legislative hammer to actually drive it through?
I think the essentials of the new framework will require that legislative basis, Mr Governor. I'm sure there's more. We are constantly trying to do things with Causeway and ICOS and those sort of IT systems to try and streamline and accelerate process, and we will continue to try to do that in the meantime. But
the links behind the scenes don't require legislative change, I would have thought.
No, they don't, and that's
I accept that.
Okay, members, that just leaves me to thank you for your attendance, for coming before the committee today. It's been extremely useful, and indeed the information that you have provided to us, we will take that on board as we develop our report. We also may need to write to you seeking further clarification on issues that has been raised today and other issues that arise during our deliberations. And again, just to go back to my opening statement in relation to the ongoing court proceedings, we do welcome the assurances that you'd give that you would come back either in writing or in person to us after those proceedings. So thank you, members. Thank you, Mr Laborie and Mr Donnelly, for attending here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members, we now need to go into closed session. So I can ask members of the public gallery to now leave. And I'd like to thank Hansard for their